Whenever I start to like someone, I wake up with their shadow. Not my shadow, theirs. It appears in my room, lingering in the corners where the light doesn't reach. It doesn't do much at first, just stretches itself across the floor like any other shadow. But no matter where I go, there it is, following me, a flickering, shifting piece of someone who has no idea how much space they're taking up in my head. The first time it happened, I was 14, and I had this ridiculous crush on my best friend's older brother, Liam. He had the kind of smile that looked like it belonged in toothpaste commercials, and he could spin a basketball on one finger like some kind of magician. One morning, I woke up to find his shadow slumped against the wall by my bedroom door. Arms folded, the vague outline of his messy hair somehow unmistakable. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for my brain to catch up and explain what was happening, but it just sat there, dark and quiet, like it had always belonged in my room. That day, I noticed it everywhere. At school, it stretched out behind me on the sidewalk like it wasn't satisfied just being there. It wanted me to notice it, like some eerie, unspoken confession of my feelings. My friends couldn't see it, of course. Shadows aren't supposed to mean anything. "Are you okay?" my best friend asked when she caught me staring at the outline of Liam's shadow trailing my shoes. "Yeah," I said, lying so hard I felt my teeth buzz. But I couldn't stop looking at it. The way it mimicked him, from the slight curve of his shoulders to the outline of his stupid basketball sneakers, was too precise to be a trick of the light. After a while, I learned something important. The shadow changes as my feelings do. If my crush is just a small, passing thing, it's faint and wispy, more of a smudge on the floor than a full presence. But if the crush grows, if it starts to bloom into something too big for me to hold, then the shadow grows too. It deepens, sharpens, becomes solid in a way that's impossible to ignore. With Liam, it never went that far. My feelings fizzled out eventually, and one day, I woke up and his shadow was gone, like it had never been there at all. I thought I'd imagined the whole thing, like maybe it was just a weird teenage hallucination brought on by hormones and bad sleep. But then, it happened again. In college, it was Sophia, the girl who sat 2 rows ahead of me in our creative writing seminar. She had this habit of doodling in the margins of her notebooks when the professor started droning on, and sometimes I'd catch little glimpses of her drawings. A moth the size of her hand, a forest of tangled branches, a set of stairs leading up to nowhere. She fascinated me. I couldn't stop thinking about her, and that's when I should have known what was coming. One morning, I woke up and there it was, Sophia's shadow. It stretched across the floor of my dorm room, flickering faintly as if it were breathing. I could see the curve of her ponytail and its silhouette, the way she always tilted her head to the side when she was concentrating. I swear I could even see the faint outline of her pen, held loosely in her hand, as though the shadow was drawing something I couldn't see. The more I liked her, the more it grew. It started moving in ways that made me nervous, sliding across the walls when I wasn't looking directly at it, pulling at my feet like it was trying to crawl closer. Sometimes, I'd see it sitting at the edge of my bed when I woke up, its head tilted slightly, like it was waiting for me to do something. Say something. I never told Sophia how I felt. I couldn't, because every time I thought about getting close to her, the shadow would shift. It would ripple, as though something under its surface was moving, something that didn't want me to take that step. By the time she transferred schools the next semester, her shadow had stretched itself so thin that it barely existed anymore. When I woke up the morning after she left, it was gone. I thought maybe I was cursed, or haunted, or both. That my feelings were so strange, so heavy, they left footprints in the dark corners of the world that no one else could see. And the worst part? I started to rely on the shadows. I began to look for them, waiting to see whose silhouette would show up next as though it would answer a question I didn't know how to ask. But then, 6 months ago, everything changed. I met a guy named Jude at a friend's birthday party. He wasn't flashy or loud. He just had this quiet confidence, like he didn't need to fight for anyone's attention because he already had it without trying. He laughed easily and talked about things that made him light up, like restoring old cars and photographing abandoned buildings. By the end of the night, I couldn't stop replaying little pieces of our conversation. And sure enough, the next morning, his shadow was waiting for me. It was sharper than any shadow I'd seen before. Darker, too, as though it had been carved out of midnight itself. It stretched across my entire bedroom floor, almost touching the edges of the walls. I tried to ignore it. I'd gotten good at that, after years of pretending the shadows didn't matter. But this one was different. It wouldn't let me. Over the next few weeks, Jude's shadow followed me relentlessly. It started appearing in places it never had before, reflecting in windows that should have shown my own shadow, lurking just a step behind me no matter where I walked. And then, it began doing things. I swear I saw it wave at me once, a small, flickering movement that made me drop my keys. Another time, it knocked, an actual, audible knock, on my closet door, as though it wanted me to open it. And the scariest part? I started to think it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was becoming something else. I couldn't stop thinking about Jude, and the more I thought about him, the more alive the shadow felt. It began humming faintly in the silence of my room, vibrating with an energy I couldn't explain. I started having dreams where the shadow stood at the foot of my bed, pointing toward my bedroom door like it wanted me to follow it. And one night I did. I woke up to the sound of my name being whispered, soft and insistent, like someone was standing right next to me. I sat up, and there it was, Jude's shadow, pooling in front of the door, rippling like water. My whole body felt cold. I didn't know what I was doing, but I stood up, walked toward it, and opened the door. The shadow slipped out into the hallway, sliding along the floor like a living thing. I followed it, my bare feet silent against the wood, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. It led me outside, into the cool night air, until I stopped in front of my neighbor's old garage, the one Jude had mentioned restoring when we talked about cars. And there he was, Jude, sitting on the steps of the garage, camera in hand, staring up at the stars. He looked at me and smiled, like he'd been expecting me. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. I opened my mouth, unsure of what to say. The shadow was gone, faded into the night around us, but I swear I could feel it humming under my feet, guiding me to this moment. "Yeah," I said finally, sitting down beside him. "Something like that." We talked for hours that night. Jude told me about the constellations, about how he liked the way abandoned places held onto memories. And I told him things I'd never told anyone before, like how I'd always felt like I was chasing something I couldn't see. The shadow hasn't come back since, and maybe it won't. Maybe it's finally done what it was trying to do all along. Show me where I was supposed to be. The first time my reflection didn't match my movements, I blamed the coffee. It was 5 in the morning, and I'd been up half the night binge-watching old sci-fi movies, the kind with ominous synth music and long shadows. Groggy, hair sticking in every direction, I stumbled into the bathroom to splash my face and face myself in the mirror. I bent forward to rinse. I stood up, and my reflection, for just a split second, stayed bent over. I froze. The mirror froze too, like a deer caught in headlights. It snapped back instantly, matching me perfectly, but that half second hung there like a cloud in my mind. I rubbed my eyes, leaned closer, and whispered, "Did you just lag?" Nothing. My reflection stared back at me, looking equally tired, equally skeptical. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Brains do weird things at 5 a.m. I shook it off, grabbed my toothbrush, and promised myself I'd cut back on caffeine. It was fine, until it wasn't. The next morning, I paid more attention to the mirror. I moved my hand up, waved, testing it. Everything was normal. Good. I leaned in close again, searching for imperfections in the glass, any excuse for the oddity from yesterday. That's when I noticed something small, almost imperceptible. A faint smudge along the bottom edge of the mirror. A fingerprint. My fingerprint. The only problem? It was on the inside of the glass. I stepped back, heart pounding in my ears. What the hell? I ran my hand across the surface. Smooth. Cold. Nothing there. I pressed my thumb to the mirror, right where the faint print sat beneath, and stared. It didn't move or fade. It wasn't mine to touch. I told myself I was tired again. That light was playing tricks. But then I raised my hand to pull at my hair. My reflection's hand stopped for half a beat before following suit. It was subtle, The kind of lag you'd only notice if you were looking for it. I stumbled out of the bathroom, swearing under my breath, and avoided the mirror for the rest of the day. By the third morning, it escalated. I brushed my teeth without looking up, head stubbornly bowed over the sink. Ignorance is bliss, I told myself. Then curiosity got the better of me. I glanced up. My reflection was already staring at me, not brushing its teeth, not waiting for me to move, just staring, head tilted slightly, mouth closed. My hand froze mid-brush. I watched, wide-eyed, as my reflection's lips curled into the faintest, slowest smile. I dropped the toothbrush into the sink with a clatter and backed away. Nope, 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 nope. My reflection tilted its head further, like it was studying me, amused. Then, just as quickly, it snapped back to normal, perfectly matching my horrified expression. I ran out of the bathroom and slammed the door behind me. For the rest of the day, I avoided mirrors like they might bite me. No bathroom trips, no glances at my phone's black screen. I didn't even look at the window as the sun set and darkened the glass. At one point, I passed a hallway mirror in my apartment and swore I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a blur of someone stepping just out of frame. By midnight, I was sitting on the couch with all the lights on, clutching my blanket like a child hiding from monsters. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my nervous daze. It was a notification I didn't recognize. Looking for you. The app didn't have a name, just a gray, empty icon. I clicked it without thinking, and my phone screen went black. After a few seconds, the camera turned on, showing my living room with me sitting there, wide-eyed, holding my phone. Then my reflection stepped into frame. It wasn't me. Not exactly. It was wearing my clothes, my face, my nervous expression, but the movements were wrong. Too smooth, deliberate, like it wasn't pretending to be me anymore. My reflection looked at the screen and smiled. I threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall and landed face down, the glow of the screen flickering out. What the hell is happening? I whispered. My voice cracked as I scrambled to my feet, suddenly aware of every dark corner in the apartment. I told myself it was a glitch, a breakdown of tech and tired nerves, but I couldn't convince myself of anything anymore. The bathroom door was open. A sliver of light from the hallway bulb sliced across the mirror. I swear I saw a shadow shift behind the glass. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment. I spent the night at a friend's place, curled up on their lumpy couch under a blanket that smelled like someone else's laundry detergent. I didn't tell them what had happened because there was no way to make it sound sane. My reflection has ideas of its own, wasn't going to win me any favors. I got home the next morning, determined to destroy the mirror. I didn't care how much I'd paid for it. I stormed into the bathroom with a hammer, ready to shatter it into oblivion. It was gone. The wall where the mirror had been was bare, the nails still sitting there like empty hands waiting to hold something. I searched the apartment, throwing open closets and cabinets, but there was no sign of it. No shards, no dust, nothing. My phone buzzed again. I picked it up with shaking hands. Found you. The bathroom door creaked behind me. When I turned around, the mirror was back. Only now, it wasn't hanging on the wall. It was propped up against the far corner of the room, tilted slightly forward, like it was watching me. And there I was, standing in it. My reflection. But this time, it didn't match me at all. My reflection's arms hung limp at its sides, head tilted like a puppet waiting for its strings to move. I stepped closer, hammer still gripped tightly in my hand. My reflection grinned, but my face stayed frozen. Let me out, it mouthed. I stumbled backward, dropping the hammer. The reflection bent down in perfect time to pick it up, holding it loosely like it was considering its weight. Then it smiled again and mouthed, "Your turn." Before I could run, the light in the bathroom flickered. The walls groaned as if the entire apartment were holding its breath. And then everything went dark. When I woke up, I was standing in the mirror. At first, I didn't believe it. I pounded against the glass, screaming, but the version of me outside just smiled. It turned the mirror slightly, propped it back on the wall, and walked out of the bathroom, leaving me staring into a cold, empty room. I'm still here. I don't know how long it's been, but I've stopped counting. Sometimes, People walk into the bathroom, friends, family, but they never hear me when I scream. They don't even look long enough to notice the difference. But I see them. I see everything. And when they leave, I smile back at them, because I know it's only a matter of time before I'll need someone else to trade places with me. It started with the shadows. At least, that's what I call them now. Those little movements you catch out of the corner of your eye but convince yourself are nothing. You know the kind. You're at your desk, you look up, and you think you see something shift in the far corner of the room. Just a trick of the light. Just tired eyes. At least, that's what I told myself at first. It wasn't like they showed up all at once. At the beginning, they were quiet, harmless. A flutter here, a flicker there. I'd look up from my phone and swear the shadows near the bookshelf were just a little darker than they should have been, or that the edge of my coat hanging on the door had rippled ever so slightly. It was nothing, I thought. A draft. A weird brain glitch. I was tired. Everyone sees things sometimes. Then things started moving. The first time it happened, I was brushing my teeth. I leaned over the sink to rinse, and when I looked up, my towel, was hanging slightly to the left of where it had been seconds before. I stared at it, foam still in my mouth, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Did I bump it? Had it been like that already? I didn't remember, but the hairs on my neck prickled as I stood there, frozen. The next morning, my keys were on the kitchen table. I never leave my keys there. I'm one of those people who always hangs them on the hook by the door. Same place every time. I try to shrug it off, but something about it bothered me all day. That evening, as I tossed my bag onto the couch, I heard the faintest sound, like someone exhaling softly right behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped over my shoes. Nothing. I stood there for a full minute, listening to the silence, my heart hammering. I told myself it was in my head, grabbed the keys, and went to bed early, because clearly, I needed sleep. But I didn't sleep. At exactly 3:14 a.m., I woke up, feeling like I'd been shaken awake. I sat up in the dark, disoriented, blinking blearily at the room. And then I heard it again, that sound. Soft. Breathing. But not mine. My breath caught, and I slowly turned my head toward the corner of the room. It was darker there, like the shadows had thickened, folding into themselves. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, and then something moved. Not much, just a ripple, like someone shifting slightly in a chair. But it was enough. I turned on the lamp so fast it nearly fell off the table. The corner was empty, just my laundry hamper sitting there, looking perfectly normal, but I could still feel it. Something wrong in the room, like the air itself had shifted. For the next few days, I avoided my apartment as much as possible. I stayed late at work. I found excuses to grab dinner with coworkers, hang out at the coffee shop, or take long, aimless walks through the neighborhood. Anything to delay going home. But no matter how late I stayed out, the shadows were always waiting. They weren't subtle anymore. I'd walk into my apartment and find little things out of place. Shoes turned the wrong way, cabinet doors slightly ajar, books stacked neatly on the floor when I knew I'd left them on the shelf. Once, I found the TV remote in the freezer. I didn't even question how it got there. I just grabbed it, shut the door, and walked away. I started hearing things, too. The faint creak of floorboards in the middle of the night. The sound of footsteps stopping just outside the bathroom door while I showered. And always, that faint, unsteady breathing when I was alone in a room. Then one night, I stopped ignoring it. It was late. I'd been sitting on the couch, half watching a movie, when I saw something move across the TV screen. At first, I thought it was part of the movie, something darting through the background of a scene. But then it happened again. A dark shape, quick and fluid, flickering along the edge of the screen. My stomach dropped. I turned and looked toward the doorway leading to my bedroom. The shadows were moving. Slowly, deliberately. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The shadow unfurled itself, stretching taller, wider, like it had been crumpled into the corner and was finally standing at full height. It wasn't just darkness anymore. It had weight, shape. It stepped closer, soundless, and I swear I saw the faintest suggestion of a face. Smooth, pale, with no features but a mouth. The mouth curled upward, stretching too wide into something that might have been a grin. I don't know how long I sat there, staring. The room felt like it was underwater, heavy and muffled. My heart pounding loud enough to echo. The shadow tilted its head, still grinning, as if waiting for me to say something. What do you want? I croaked. It didn't answer, but the grin widened. Then it turned, melted back into the darkness, and disappeared into the bedroom. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep for days. I started leaving every light on in the apartment, pacing the rooms like I could catch it before it showed up again. But the thing about shadows? They thrive in the light. I started seeing them everywhere. In the corners of rooms, under tables, curling along the ceiling like smoke. I could feel them watching me, waiting. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a duffel bag, packed a few things, and left. I didn't even know where I was going. I just drove. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the sound of the tires on the road and the occasional groan of my old car. I stopped at a cheap motel on the edge of a nowhere town and locked myself in, every light burning. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. The room was small but plain, with nowhere for the shadows to hide. I sat on the bed, staring at the walls, whispering, "It's gone. It's gone." And then I heard it. Soft, barely audible, breathing. I turned toward the bathroom door. The light was on, but the crack underneath it was pitch black. The shadows seeped out slowly, curling along the floor like they'd been waiting for me to stop running. The faint sound of laughter filled the room, low and hollow, echoing off the walls. And I knew then that you can't escape shadows. They're always with you, always waiting, just out of sight. Even now, sitting here, I can feel them, watching, waiting. And if you're reading this, look around. In the corners, under your bed, behind the door. They're there, and they're smiling. When I woke up, the wind was knocking on my window. Not at my window, like a storm rattling the glass. It was knocking. 3 precise, deliberate knocks, like a guest at the front door. I bolted upright in bed, heart hammering, as the knocks came again. Tap, tap, tap. I stared at the window. Outside, the sky was dark and restless, clouds rolling in unnatural spirals. The wind howled softly, as though whispering something I couldn't quite hear. My curtains fluttered, though the window was closed, and as I stared, I realized there was a shape in the glass. A shadow, pressed against it. The shadow knocked again. I swallowed hard and whispered to myself, "It's just a trick. Just wind and shadows. Just my brain being weird. Open it." The voice didn't come from me. It came from the glass. I froze. The shadow on the window grew sharper, more distinct, a hand, flat against the pane. 5 fingers splayed and impossibly long. There was no face, no detail, just the dark outline of something that shouldn't be there. The hand knocked one more time, softer this time. Tap, tap. I don't know what made me do it. Curiosity, maybe, or the kind of terror that makes you reckless. I swung my legs out of bed and stepped toward the window. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned in close. "Who's there?" I whispered. The shadow on the other side tilted its head. Its hand flattened further against the window, and the glass shimmered. It rippled like water, soft waves spreading outward. I took a step back. Let me in. It wasn't just a voice. It was voices, layered on top of one another. Men, women, children, all speaking in eerie harmony. I turned to grab my phone, my mind racing, but when I looked back, the window was open. I didn't hear it unlock. I didn't hear the creak of wood or glass. It was just open, curtains billowing, a chill slithering into the room. My pulse roared in my ears as I took another step back. The shadow stepped in. I don't know how to describe it. It didn't crawl or walk. It poured through the window like smoke made solid, the vague shape of a person shifting and twisting as it pooled onto the floor. For one awful moment, the shadow sat there, still as death, filling my room with a silence so heavy I could barely breathe. Then it stood up. The shadow was tall. It reached nearly to the ceiling, its shape flickering like candlelight. Though it had no features, I could feel it staring at me, watching. "You woke me." Its voice wrapped around the room like a snake, tightening until the walls felt too close. "I didn't wake anyone," I stammered, backing toward the door. "I don't know what you are." "You need to." "You called," it said, tilting its head slowly. I answered. "Called? I didn't call you." The shadow extended its arm, longer now, stretching out like ink spreading across paper, and pointed. I turned to follow its gesture. My desk. On it sat a book I didn't recognize. The book was small and bound in black leather, its cover marked with symbols that seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. It hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. The shadow took a step forward, its form blurring and reshaping itself with each movement. "You opened the door," it said softly. I picked up the book, my hands trembling. It felt cold and wrong in my grip, as though it were vibrating faintly with something alive. I flipped it open, and there, on the first page, in handwriting that looked like it had been burned into the paper, were the words, "You are the keeper of the in-between." I looked up at the shadow. "What does that mean?" The shadow tilted its head again. "It means you belong to the doorway now." "What doorway?" It pointed again, this time at my bedroom door. Except it wasn't my door anymore. The wood had changed. It was taller, older, covered in carvings that matched the symbols on the book. The knob was no longer brass but something darker, slick like obsidian. From the crack beneath it, a thin mist curled into the room. My throat went dry. "That's not my door," I said hoarsely. "It is now," the shadow replied. The mist began to seep upward, spilling into the room in tendrils. I could feel it, cold and hungry, curling around my ankles, snaking toward the walls. The room itself seemed to shudder. My posters fluttered, the floor groaned, the ceiling cracked. "You must choose," the shadow said, its voice growing louder. "The door or the void." I stepped back, nearly tripping over my bed. "I don't understand. What do you mean, choose?" The book opened the way. The door leads forward. The void swallows all. I looked at the shadow. It wasn't just a shape anymore. It was growing, unraveling into the room like smoke spilling from a fire. The walls creaked as though they were buckling under its weight, the mist rising higher. "Choose," the shadow roared, and this time the voices within it screamed. I turned to the door. It was pulsing now, glowing faintly from the carvings. My hands shook as I gripped the doorknob. It was ice cold, sending a shock through my arm, but I twisted it anyway and threw the door open. I expected to see my hallway. I was wrong. On the other side was a bridge. It stretched into darkness, narrow and endless, with no railings to hold onto. The mist poured onto it like a waterfall, spilling into the void below. I couldn't see where it led, but far in the distance, a faint light glimmered. Behind me, the shadow surged forward. "Choose." I had no time to think. I stepped onto the bridge. The door slammed shut behind me with a sound like a thunderclap, and I was plunged into silence. The bridge was solid under my feet, but the darkness around me felt alive, like it was waiting for me to fall. I took a deep breath and started walking. The light ahead pulsed softly, as though it knew I was coming. I couldn't tell how far away it was, but with every step, I felt the weight of the book in my hands growing heavier. I flipped it open again, desperate for answers. This time, the pages weren't empty. They were filled with instructions, rules. Do not stop walking. Do not look back. The bridge only goes forward. I glanced behind me, instinctively ignoring the warning. The bridge was gone. Nothing but the void stretched behind me, cold and endless. My chest tightened, and I turned forward again, forcing myself to keep moving. I don't know how long I walked. Time didn't exist there, not really. But eventually, the light grew closer, brighter, until I could see what it was, a door. Another door. This one was different. It was gold, humming with energy, the carvings along its surface shifting like liquid metal. The book burned hot in my hands as I reached for the knob, my heart pounding. I knew, somehow, that this was it, the way forward. The moment my fingers touched the door, the bridge vanished. The void roared around me, a cacophony of voices and wind and silence all at once, and the book in my hands exploded into dust. I pulled the door open and fell through. When I woke up, I was in my bed. The black feather was gone. The book was gone. The door was back to normal, but the wind outside still whispered my name. So here's my question. If you woke up with a doorway to the unknown, would you have the courage to step through? And if you did, what would you find waiting for you on the other side? No one ever knew who lived in the house at the end of the road. The house itself had a way of blending in. Its walls weathered to the same gray as the mist that seemed to settle permanently over that part of town. Windows that should have reflected sunlight always looked dim, and the yard, though perfectly trimmed, was unnaturally still. It was the kind of house that made you cross the street without realizing why, as if some deep, primal part of you sensed it was better left alone. I wasn't afraid of the house. Not until the letter came. It appeared on my kitchen table one morning, though I didn't remember seeing it when I poured my first cup of coffee. The envelope was dark green, almost black, its texture strange under my fingertips, like it was stitched together from the fabric of night itself. No postage, no name, just my initials etched in silver ink. Inside was a card, and in the center of it, a single line written in careful, slanted handwriting. The house is waiting. Come tonight. Bring no one. I tried to ignore it, tossed it in the trash, drank 3 more cups of coffee, and spent the day telling myself it was someone's idea of a joke. But as evening fell, the thought of that house at the end of the road began to take up more space in my mind, crowding out everything else. By sunset, the letter was back on my table, pristine and uncrumpled, as though it had never been touched. So, of course, I went. The house looked different up close, less forgotten and more like it was holding its breath. The front door was open, just a crack, but it swung wider as I approached, the hinges groaning softly in protest. Beyond it lay darkness so deep it seemed to spill over the threshold, pooling around my feet. I stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind me, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence and blackness. Then, faint light began to bloom around me, soft and golden, spilling from the edges of lanterns mounted on the walls. The entryway was enormous, the kind of grand space meant to make visitors feel small. The wallpaper was faded but ornate, curling gold patterns that seemed to shift if I looked at them too long. A staircase curved upward into shadows, its banister polished to a high gleam. The air smelled faintly of something sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. "Hello?" I called, my voice swallowed by the stillness. No answer. The lanterns along the walls flared slightly, one by one, guiding me forward into a long hallway lined with doors. Each door was different. Some plain wood, others covered in intricate carvings, stained glass, or layers of chipped paint. Small brass plaques were mounted beside each, though the writing on them was too faint to read. I stepped closer to one of the doors and placed my hand on the surface. It was warm. Before I could move away, the door creaked open. Inside was not a room. Not really. It was a memory. A scene that looked so vivid and real that I felt I could step through the doorway and lose myself completely. It was my childhood home, my parents' living room, exactly as I remembered it, down to the scuffed coffee table and the blanket draped over the couch. And there I was, a younger version of myself, no more than 8 or 9, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, talking to someone I couldn't see. I backed away, slamming the door shut. The plaque next to it now glowed faintly, and the writing was clear. "The friend you forgot." My hands shook as I moved down the hallway. Each door had a memory behind it, a piece of my life that I'd buried or let slip away. The apology you never made, the promise you broke, the love you let go. The scenes inside were sharp and painfully clear, like looking into a mirror and seeing not just your reflection, but all the parts of yourself you tried to hide. I didn't know how long I wandered, opening doors I wished I hadn't. Each one weighed heavier on me, the memories sticking to my skin like wet leaves. Finally, I reached a door at the very end of the hallway. It was different, larger than the others, its surface black and polished like obsidian. There was no plaque beside it, no indication of what lay beyond. The handle was cold as I turned it. The room on the other side was empty. No furniture, no windows, just smooth black walls that seemed to absorb the lantern light. And in the center of the floor, there was a mirror. It wasn't like any mirror I'd seen before. Its surface rippled like water, reflecting nothing but a shifting darkness. I stepped closer, my breath fogging faintly in the cold air. As I leaned over it, the ripples stilled, and something began to take shape. At first, it was my face, staring back at me. But it wasn't just me. My reflection was wrong. Its eyes were too sharp, its smile just a little too wide. It raised a hand in unison with mine. But there was a lag, a hesitation, as though it was deciding whether to mimic me or not. And then it stopped. The reflection's hand fell to its side, and its head tilted slightly. It was looking at me now, not as me, but at me, studying me like a scientist might study a specimen. My stomach churned. I turned to leave, but the door behind me was gone. "Why did you come?" the reflection asked. The voice sounded like mine, but layered, as though something else was speaking alongside it. "I don't know," I whispered. The reflection smiled, a grin full of teeth that looked too sharp. "You're here because you're looking for something." "What are you talking about?" "You think this house holds answers," it continued, taking a step closer to the edge of the mirror. "But houses like this only show you what you bring inside." It reached upward then, pressing its palms against the underside of the glass, and I stumbled back as cracks spiderwebbed across the surface. Darkness oozed from the fractures, curling like smoke, and I realized, too late, that it wasn't trying to escape. It was trying to pull me in. The room groaned, the walls vibrating as though the house itself was alive and angry. The reflection's hands pushed harder against the glass, its smile growing as the cracks widened. I turned, clawing at the wall where the door had been, my fingers scraping against smooth stone. "You wanted answers," the voice called behind me, closer now, echoing. "The truth is here. Just step inside." The ground trembled beneath me, and when I glanced back, I saw the reflection crawling up through the mirror, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes glowed faintly, locked onto me, and I knew if it caught me, if it touched me, it would replace me. I squeezed my eyes shut. "This isn't real," I whispered. "This isn't real." When I opened my eyes, I was back outside, standing in front of the house. My clothes were dry, the mist had returned, and the front door was shut tight. The house was silent, staring back at me as though it hadn't just tried to consume me whole. In my hand, I found a single object, a shard of black glass, cold and humming faintly in my palm. The house never disappeared, and I never told anyone what happened that night. But sometimes, when I catch my reflection in the mirror, it lags, just for a second, and smiles before I do. The letter came in the mouth of a crow. I was on my balcony, sipping burnt coffee and watching the city smear itself awake. Traffic grumbling, gray lights spilling between buildings. When the crow landed on the railing, I'd seen crows before, but not like this one. It was big, bigger than any crow I'd ever seen, with feathers so black they seemed to drink the light. It tilted its head at me, a motion that felt too deliberate, too human, and then, with a sharp shake, it dropped the letter at my feet. I stared at it, blinking through the haze of my morning brain. "You want a tip or something?" I muttered. The crow cawed once, a sound that scraped the inside of my skull like metal on metal, and then it flew away, disappearing into the gloom. The letter was wax-sealed, a deep, blood-red stamp pressed with a symbol I didn't recognize. 2 concentric circles with lines twisting outward, like a spider's web. The paper was thick and soft, like it had been made by hand, and my name was scrawled across the front in ink so dark it almost looked wet. I wasn't expecting mail, definitely not crow mail, but I opened it. Inside, written in careful cursive, "You are invited. Midnight, 313, Blackthorn Lane. Do not bring light." That was it. No sender, no explanation, just those few words and the unmistakable feeling that something had already seen me open it. I should have thrown it away. Normal people throw away ominous letters hand-delivered by crows, but I didn't. I sat there staring at it, my coffee forgotten, my heartbeat like a drumbeat under my ribs. It was curiosity, I think, or maybe something deeper, a pull. That night, I didn't even try to pretend I wasn't going. At 11:30, I left my apartment, Blackthorn Lane was in a part of town I didn't know well, tucked between old warehouses and silent train tracks. I parked my car a block away, and as soon as I stepped onto the street, I felt it. The air was heavier here, pressing down like a hand on my shoulders. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the streetlights were dead, but I could see shapes moving in the shadows. Figures slipping through alleys, too fluid to be human. 313 Blackthorn Lane was an abandoned theater. Or it looked abandoned. The sign above the entrance was rusted and unreadable, the windows covered in years of grime. But the door was open. I stepped inside, my shoes tapping against the cracked marble floor. The lobby was dim, lit only by a faint, sourceless glow. Dust hung in the air like smoke, but it didn't smell like an old building. It smelled like earth, like something growing where it shouldn't. Ahead of me, double doors led to the main theater. They were cracked open, and through them, I could hear faint music, a soft, off-kilter piano melody, like someone playing with two broken hands. I pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The theater was enormous. Rows of velvet seats stretched out into darkness, their red fabric faded to brown. On stage, someone, or something, was playing the piano. I couldn't see them clearly, just a hunched figure in a coat that hung off its shoulders like old skin. It played slowly, deliberately, the notes echoing through the cavernous space. I turned to look for other people, and that's when I realized I wasn't alone. The seats weren't empty. They were filled. Shapes sat in the chairs, motionless and silent. At first, I thought they were mannequins, figures draped in tattered clothes, some slumped, some upright. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw the faint rise and fall of chests, the slow twitch of fingers. They were breathing. They were alive. And every single one of them was watching the stage. I don't know how long I stood there, too afraid to move, but then the piano stopped. The figure on stage turned to face the theater, its head snapping up too quickly, and I saw its face, or what was left of it. Hollow eyes, a mouth stretched too wide, like someone had pulled it open and forgotten to close it again. It raised one hand, long and crooked, and pointed straight at me. The crowd moved all at once. Heads turned, necks cracked. Dozens of faces, pale and empty, snapped toward me in unison, like puppets pulled by the same string. My legs locked up, and I couldn't breathe. A whisper filled the room, too quiet to understand but growing louder, crawling up the walls, buzzing in my ears. "Do not bring light." The words on the invitation hit me like a fist. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my shaking fingers swiping up to turn on the flashlight. The whisper became a roar, and as soon as I hit the button, the beam cut through the dark like a knife. The crowd screamed. It was a sound I can't describe, animal and human and wrong. They recoiled from the light, shrinking back into the shadows, their bodies twisting and bending like smoke. On stage, the figure shrieked and staggered backward, its form flickering like a bad signal. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. I barreled through the double doors, the flashlight beam swinging wildly in front of me, and didn't stop until I was outside. The air hit me like a bucket of ice water, cold and sharp, and I collapsed onto the cracked sidewalk, gasping for breath. Behind me, the theater was silent again. The doors hung open, but nothing followed me. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't go home, either. I drove to a 24-hour diner on the edge of town and sat in a sticky vinyl booth, watching the sky slowly turn gray through the window. I couldn't stop shaking. The invitation was still in my pocket, the paper warm, as if it had been sitting next to a fire. At sunrise, I pulled it out and stared at it. The words had changed. The same elegant handwriting, but now it read, "We will see you again." I burned the letter in the diner's parking lot, watching the ashes scatter in the morning wind. But no matter how far I drive or how many locks I put on my doors, I still hear it sometimes, at night, when the streets are quiet. The soft, broken melody of a piano playing somewhere just out of sight. And I know they meant it. They will see me again. And when they do, I don't think I'll be able to leave. You know how in movies, the crow is always a bad omen? It sits on a fence post, cuts dramatically, and then bam, someone gets cursed, or a zombie plague starts. Well, this crow didn't do anything quite so theatrical. It just stared at me. I was walking home from work late, too late, under a dim, flickering streetlight that seemed determined to add to the ambience of potential horror movie opening scene. There, perched on the edge of a dumpster, was the biggest crow I'd ever seen, its glossy black feathers reflecting the orange glow of the lamp. And it wasn't moving, not a single twitch, just staring at me, unblinking, as though I'd wandered into its turf. "Nice bird," I mumbled awkwardly because that's what I do when I'm nervous, make small talk with wildlife. The crow tilted its head, as if considering me. I sped up, resisting the urge to look back, because everyone knows you don't look back in situations like that. When I got home, I figured that was the end of it. I dropped my keys on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the couch. But then, right outside my window, tap, tap, tap. I froze. The sound was soft, deliberate, like the faint knocking of a tiny hand. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, and there it was, the crow, sitting on the fire escape railing, mere inches from the glass, peering in like it had been invited. "What do you want?" I said, half expecting it to caw or fly off. Instead, it just sat there, staring at me with eyes that looked too smart for a bird. Eyes that knew something. I don't know why, but I got up and opened the window. I can't explain it. Something about the way the crow looked at me felt like it was waiting for me to act, like I'd regret it if I didn't. The cool night air swept in, and the crow hopped inside my apartment. "You better not poop in here," I muttered. The crow ignored me. It flew, silent and graceful, straight to my kitchen table, where it landed with a soft thud. Then, to my absolute disbelief, it dropped something out of its beak. A key. A small, silver key with an ornate handle. It clinked on the table, gleaming under the kitchen light. I stared at it, then at the crow. "Where did you get that?" I asked. The crow tilted its head, as if saying, "Do you want to find out?" And here's where I tell you something important about myself. I can't let mysteries go. Some people would have shooed the crow out, tossed the key in a drawer, and moved on with their lives. But me? No. I'm the person who follows strange birds that deliver keys into apartments. So, I picked up the key. It was cold and heavier than it looked. The crow cawed softly, a short, clipped sound, then flew back out the window. I followed it instinctively, slipping on my shoes and grabbing my coat. I don't know why I trusted it, but I did. It felt like I had to. Like that key had been meant for me. Outside, the crow perched on a street lamp, watching me. When I stepped onto the sidewalk, it took off, soaring through the night in slow, deliberate arcs. It never got too far ahead. It waited for me, led me. It took me to the old part of town, where the buildings are squat in brick and stubbornly refuse to change, no matter how much the rest of the city modernizes. I followed the crow down an alleyway I'd never noticed before. A narrow, crooked path lined with ivy-covered walls and cobblestones slick with rain. At the end of the alley was a door. The door was impossibly out of place. Large, wooden, and ancient, like something stolen from a medieval castle. It had a brass keyhole, a tarnished lion's head knocker, and, most importantly, no surrounding building. Just the door, freestanding, as if the wall had forgotten to finish itself. The crow landed on top of the door, cawed once, and stared down at me expectantly. I hesitated. Logic screamed at me to turn back, to pretend none of this had happened and go home. But the key was warm in my hand now, pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat. Before I could change my mind, I stepped forward and slid the key into the lock. The door opened with a deep, groaning creak. Beyond it was, not the alley, not anywhere I'd ever seen before. It was a forest. The air smelled of pine and earth and something faintly sweet, like honey. Moonlight poured through the trees, brighter than it had any right to be, illuminating a narrow path that stretched deeper into the woods. I stepped through the door, half expecting the forest to dissolve around me like a dream. It didn't. The door clicked shut behind me, and when I turned, it was gone. Just trees. The crow landed on my shoulder, startling me. "Well, you better know where we're going," I said, because talking to birds had apparently become my new hobby. The crow cawed softly, almost reassuringly, and nudged its beak toward the path. I walked. The forest was silent, except for the soft crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional hoot of an unseen owl. The deeper I went, the stranger the woods became. The trees looked wrong. Their trunks twisted unnaturally, forming shapes that almost resembled faces. Flowers glowed faintly in the dark, their petals shifting as though breathing. And then I saw it, a lantern, glowing warmly in the distance. Next to it stood a figure. As I approached, I saw that it was an old man in a dark coat, holding the lantern high. His face was hidden by shadows, but when he spoke, his voice was deep and kind. "Welcome, traveler," he said. "You've come far." "I don't even know where I've come," I replied. The man chuckled softly. "Few do, but the key always knows." He gestured to a small wooden box resting on a stump nearby. "It's time to decide," he said. "Decide what?" I asked. "To go forward, or to return." Inside the box were two items, a feather, as black as the crow, and a small, brass coin. "The feather is for those who want to explore," he said. "The coin is for those who want to forget." I looked at the crow still perched on my shoulder. It stared back, unblinking. "What happens if I choose the feather?" I asked. The man smiled faintly. "Then the story continues." "And the coin?" "Then you wake up at home, safe in your bed, and you never find the door again." I stared at the box, my heart pounding. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Finally, I reached for the feather. "Good," the man said softly. "The story was always yours to finish." And with that, he vanished. The lantern flickered out. The crow cawed once, its wings spreading wide, and I felt myself pulled forward, deeper into the woods, deeper into whatever lay ahead. I don't know where the path will take me. I don't know if I'll ever see the door again. But I do know this. Sometimes, when a crow hands you a key, you take it, because some stories are worth following. So, tell me, if a door appeared in front of you, would you open it? Would you choose the coin or the feather? It started when I found the book. It wasn't hidden in an attic or buried under piles of forgotten things like in those old stories. It was right there on a shelf, tucked between cookbooks and travel guides at a secondhand shop downtown. It wasn't like the others, though. Its cover was dark blue, almost black, with no title or author. The spine had no markings, just smooth leather that looked somehow untouched, like it had been waiting. When I pulled it free, something rustled behind me, like paper being turned by unseen hands, and for a split second, I swore I heard someone whisper my name. I should have put the book back, but curiosity always wins with me. I carried it to the front desk, where the cashier, a man with thick glasses and fingers stained with ink, didn't even look up as he rang me out. "You found it, then?" he said quietly. "What do you mean?" I asked. He glanced at me for the first time, and I noticed his eyes were two different colors, one brown, the other the milky white of a blind man's. "Some books don't wait for readers," he said, tapping the cover lightly. "Some books choose them." I laughed nervously, but he didn't smile. "Enjoy," he said, handing me the bag. I left quickly, the book tucked under my arm like it might sprout legs and escape. At home, I dropped it on my coffee table and stared at it, trying to decide what made it feel so strange. It was heavier than it looked, for one. When I finally opened it, the pages were blank. Not empty, blank, as though they were waiting for something. Disappointed, I flipped through them, but there wasn't a single word. Then, as I went to close it, I noticed something strange on the very last page. A name, my name, written in that same dark ink, small and precise. I stared at it, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears. I hadn't written it. I hadn't told anyone I'd bought the book. And yet, there it was, my name, as though it had always been there. I ran my finger over the ink, half expecting it to smudge, but it didn't. Instead, the ink felt warm against my skin, and when I pulled my hand away, new words appeared just below it. "We've been waiting for you." Right the first line. I blinked, feeling like the room had shifted slightly. I waited for the ink to fade, but it didn't. The words just sat there, patient, inviting. "This is a trick," I muttered, trying to convince myself, though I couldn't explain how. I grabbed a pen from my desk and hovered it over the paper, hesitating. Write the first line? Fine. I'd play along. I wrote, "It started when I found the book." The ink sank into the page, and for a moment, nothing happened. I set the pen down, feeling a little ridiculous, but as I stood up to walk away, the book moved. It vibrated softly, as though something inside had been woken up. I watched, frozen, as the words I'd written melted and spread across the page, twisting and curling like living shadows. Slowly, they rearranged themselves into a single sentence. And now it begins. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. I slammed the book shut, breathing hard. I told myself I was imagining things, that I'd been working too hard, sleeping too little. But when I looked down, the book had changed. The smooth leather cover now bore a single embossed symbol, a key entwined with roots, and it looked familiar, though I couldn't say why. That night, I dreamed of a forest. It was deep and endless, the kind of place where the air feels thicker and time doesn't move the way it should. The trees were ancient, their bark covered in strange markings that glowed faintly in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, a soft humming echoed, like a melody just out of reach. I followed it, my feet sinking into moss that whispered with every step. At the center of the forest was a clearing, and in the clearing stood a single door. The door was identical to the one on the book's cover, dark wood, carved with the key and the roots. It had no frame, no walls around it, just a door standing alone. And when I touched it, the humming stopped. The air went silent, thick with expectation. Slowly, the door creaked open, and I woke up gasping for breath. The book was on my nightstand, though I'd left it in the living room. I didn't touch it again for days, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I felt it watching me, even when I wasn't in the same room. Every time I passed it, I swore I heard faint rustling, like someone turning pages. Finally, on the fourth day, I gave in. I opened it, and the first words on the page read, "Welcome back." This time, the book wasn't blank. There were paragraphs, whole pages filled with text I didn't remember writing. They described everything: finding the book, my name on the last page, even the dream of the forest. The ink was mine, my handwriting, my words, but I hadn't written them. My hands shook as I turned the page. Near the bottom, a question had been added, one I hadn't written. "Will you open the door?" I slammed the book shut, but it was too late. I already knew the answer. That night, I dreamed of the forest again. The same trees, the same humming, the same door. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pushed it open and stepped through. I woke up somewhere else. It was still dark, but the forest had changed. It wasn't a dream anymore. I could feel the wind, smell the earth, hear the distant hum in the air. The door was gone, and in its place was the book, sitting open on a mossy stump. On the pages were new words, freshly written. "The story is yours now. Keep going." I picked up the book, its weight familiar now, like it belonged to me. I don't know where I am, or how long I've been here. The forest goes on forever, and the path ahead shifts every time I blink. But I'm not afraid anymore. I write in the book as I walk, about the creatures I see in the shadows, the rivers that flow upside down, the sky that hums like a violin string. The words appear as I think them, and I don't question it. Sometimes, I hear footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate, as though someone's following. I haven't seen who or what it is, but I know it's reading, waiting. Maybe it's always been part of the story too. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find the book next. I first found the man in the mirror when I was 12 years old. It was a late autumn afternoon, and I'd been sent to the upstairs bathroom to scrub the dirt off my face after climbing trees in the backyard. My mom always said I came back looking like I'd been wrestling the ground itself, and that day was no exception. The window was open just a crack, and the cool air had that sharp bite that sneaks in just before winter arrives. I turned on the tap, splashing water on my face, and when I straightened up, I noticed him. He wasn't me. Oh, he looked like me. Same messy hair, same smudge of dirt on one cheek. But there was something wrong about him, something just a little off. His expression was too still, his eyes too sharp, watching me like I was the one trapped behind the glass. My breath caught. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But when I looked again, he was still there, staring back at me with the faintest hint of a smile. Not a friendly one. I bolted out of the bathroom, dripping water down the hallway, and refused to go back in. My mom scolded me for the mess I made, muttering something about me being too dramatic. But I didn't care. I wouldn't touch that mirror again. Not for a long time. Years passed, and I grew up like everyone does, forgetting most of the strange fears of childhood. I stopped believing in monsters under the bed, in shadows that moved on their own, in whispers that might not have come from the wind. And I forgot about the man in the mirror, or at least, I pretended I did. The next time I saw him, I was 16. It was early morning, that weird gray hour when the world feels half asleep, and I was brushing my teeth before school. My mind was somewhere else, already thinking about a biology test I hadn't studied for, when I caught it. Movement that didn't match mine. My reflection had stopped brushing. I froze, the toothbrush halfway to my mouth, and watched as he slowly tilted his head, just a fraction of an inch, and smiled. A full, wide smile that didn't belong on my face. I stumbled back, my elbow knocking into a bottle on the counter, sending it crashing to the floor. He didn't flinch. He just watched me, eyes bright with something that made my stomach twist. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I bolted downstairs, my heart pounding, my skin cold despite the heat from the vents. From then on, mirrors became something I avoided. I brushed my teeth in the dark, washed my face with my eyes shut, and stopped looking into reflective windows when I passed them at night. It worked for a while, out of sight, out of mind. But you don't realize how much of the world reflects until you're trying not to see it. Puddles, spoons, glass doors, they all became traps I had to sidestep. My friends didn't understand, of course. They teased me about it, said I was afraid of my own shadow. And maybe I was. It was easier to let them think I was weird than to explain the truth. That there was someone else wearing my face, and I didn't want to know what he wanted. The third time I saw him, I was 23. I just moved into my first apartment, a tiny one-bedroom with pipes that clanged at all hours and neighbors who slammed doors like they were angry at the world. There was a mirror on the back of the bathroom door, and I'd been meaning to take it down, but I hadn't gotten around to it yet. That night, I woke up suddenly, unsure why. The apartment was silent, the kind of deep, muffled silence that usually meant snow had fallen. I sat up in bed, my skin prickling with the sense that someone was watching me. And then I saw it. The bathroom door was open just enough for me to see the mirror, and in the dark reflection, I saw him. Standing in the bathroom, staring into the mirror like he was waiting for me to notice. My blood went cold. I didn't move. I couldn't. My brain was screaming to look away, to hide under the blanket like I was a kid again, but I couldn't tear my eyes from him. Slowly, he lifted a hand, and his fingers curled like he was beckoning me closer. I don't remember falling asleep. The next thing I knew, it was morning, sunlight streaming through the blinds, and the bathroom door was shut. I tried to tell myself it was a nightmare, just stress from the move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, just waiting behind the glass. That's when the knocking started. It began faint, just a soft tap-tap-tap coming from the bathroom at night. At first, I thought it was the pipes, or maybe the neighbor's cat, but then it grew louder, rhythmic, persistent. Tap, tap, tap. Always 3 knocks, and always in the dead of night. I started sleeping on the couch, telling myself I was just being paranoid, that my imagination was getting the better of me. But one night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, I heard a voice. Soft, like it was coming from far away. Let me out. I sat up so fast I nearly fell off the couch, my heart hammering in my chest. Who's there? I whispered, though I knew the answer. The bathroom mirror. The man behind the glass. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was getting rid of the mirror. I grabbed a screwdriver and took it off the door, my hands shaking the whole time. When it finally came free, I dragged it outside to the alley behind the building. It felt heavier than it should have, like it didn't want to leave. I leaned it against the dumpster and turned away, but as I did, I swear I saw movement in the glass. I didn't stop to check. I just walked back inside and shut the door. That night, for the first time in weeks, the apartment was silent. No knocking. No voices. I slept for 12 hours straight. When I woke up, I almost felt normal again. Like maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But mirrors are everywhere. The next day, I caught my reflection in the window of a parked car, and for the briefest moment, he was there. Smiling. Watching. I smashed the bathroom mirror, and I threw it away, but it didn't matter. He's not in the glass. He is the glass. I don't know what he wants, or why he looks like me, but I know he's getting closer. Sometimes, when I walk past a window, I see him walking too, but his steps don't quite match mine. Sometimes his reflection lingers just a little too long after I've moved. And sometimes, God help me, I hear knocking coming from the walls, like he's trying to find another way in. I haven't looked in a mirror for months now. I keep the lights low, the windows covered. I avoid puddles when it rains, and I drink my coffee from mugs so black I can't see my face in them. It doesn't matter. I can feel him watching me, waiting. Last night, I woke up to find a shard of glass on my pillow. Just one, small and sharp, glinting faintly in the dark. I don't know where it came from, and I don't want to know. But when I picked it up, I saw him in it. Not smiling this time, just staring, like he was hungry. I don't know how much time I have left before he comes through completely. Maybe he'll wear my face. Maybe he'll take my place. All I know is this. When you see something in the mirror that isn't you, don't look closer. Don't try to understand it. And whatever you do, don't let it see that you're afraid. It wants that. It needs that. And once it knows what you're afraid of, it will never stop knocking. There's a house that appears whenever I fall for someone. Not just any house, a very specific house. It's always the same, no matter who I like, no matter where I am. The first time I saw it, I was 16, and it appeared on the walk home from school, tucked between two buildings where no house should have fit. It was tall and narrow, with dark green shutters and a pointed roof that looked like it belonged in a storybook. The door was always slightly ajar, like it was waiting for me to notice. I didn't go inside that first time. I was too afraid. I just stood there on the sidewalk staring at it, wondering how no one else seemed to see this impossibly strange thing that had just inserted itself into my reality. The next day, it was gone. I spent weeks trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, even as I secretly hoped I'd see it again. I didn't see the house again until 3 years later, during my second year of college. This time, it appeared in the park where I went jogging. It was standing right there in the middle of the trail, impossible to ignore, like it had sprouted up overnight. The same dark green shutters, the same crooked roof, the same door, ever so slightly open. I just met someone then, a boy named Tom, who laughed like his whole body was in on the joke and read books like he was trying to memorize every word. I remember stopping dead in my tracks, sweat running down my back, staring at the house. I knew, instinctively, that it was there because of Tom. Somehow, my feelings had summoned it, like the house could smell affection in the air and decided to show up and do whatever it did. That's when I started to wonder if the house wasn't so much appearing as it was following me. The thing about the house is that it doesn't force itself on you. It just waits. The door hangs open in this quiet, almost polite way, as if it's saying, no pressure. But, you could come in, and you'd think I would, out of curiosity, if nothing else, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about the house feels so final, like stepping inside would mean committing to something I didn't understand yet. So I ignored it. I ran past it, breathless and pretending I didn't care, and eventually, it disappeared again. The next time, I wasn't so lucky. It showed up during my commute to work last year. I was walking to the train station, half asleep and clutching my coffee, when I turned a corner and there it was. It had wedged itself into a narrow alley, squeezed between a laundromat and a bakery. The morning light hit the windows at just the right angle to make them look like eyes, watching me. That's when I started noticing something new. There were rooms inside. I couldn't see all of them, not really, but glimpses of them. If I tilted my head just right, I'd catch a flash of movement, like curtains fluttering or a chair rocking slowly back and forth. I stopped walking and just stared, my heart pounding in my ears. I felt like the house was inviting me this time, like it had waited long enough and wanted me to step through the door already. And the worst part? I wanted to. I wanted to so badly I could feel it in my bones, like an itch under my skin. I thought about what might be inside. Would I find answers? Would I see the person I liked? Was the house trying to show me something, or warn me about something? I didn't know, but I couldn't do it. I turned around, walked back to the train station, and tried not to think about the dark green shutters and the rocking chair. But the house kept coming back. Every time I liked someone new, it reappeared. Always in places that shouldn't be able to hold it, always with the same slightly open door, as though it were beckoning. I started to notice a pattern. The closer I got to the person I liked, the closer the house got to me. Once, when I'd spent an entire afternoon texting back and forth with someone I thought might be more than a friend, the house appeared in my dreams. It was sitting at the edge of a field, surrounded by fog, with its crooked roof cutting into the sky like a knife. I walked up to it in the dream, closer than I'd ever dared to get in real life. But when I reached the door, I couldn't move my hand. I just stood there, staring at the sliver of darkness waiting inside. While the fog pressed against my back like it was trying to push me in, I woke up sweating, my sheets tangled around me, and the next morning, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder on the way to work. And then, 2 weeks ago, it showed up again. This time, it was in the parking lot outside my apartment, standing neatly in the spot where my car should have been. I just started seeing someone. This girl named Emily, who had this way of asking questions that made me feel like I'd been seen for the first time. The house was different this time, though. For one thing, the windows were lit from the inside, glowing faintly like there was a fire burning somewhere deep in its belly. For another, I swear I heard something. A faint creaking sound, like footsteps on old wooden floors, drifting out through the open door. I stood there for what felt like an hour, staring at the light spilling out into the dark parking lot. I think I even took a step forward without realizing it, because I suddenly felt the warmth of the house's glow on my skin, like I was standing too close to a flame. And that's when I heard it, a voice, quiet and soft, drifting through the open door. It said my name. I turned and ran. I don't even know why. Maybe it was because the voice was mine. The house hasn't shown up since, but I can feel it. I can feel it waiting. I keep thinking about what it all means. Maybe the house is a test, like, if I step inside, I'll finally understand something about myself that I'm too afraid to face. Maybe it's a mirror, showing me the parts of my feelings I don't want to admit. Or maybe it's a trap, and once I go in, I'll never come back out. Here's the thing that keeps me up at night, though. What if the house isn't following me at all? What if I've been following it? What if the house has been leading me, step by step, towards something bigger? Some truth, or some choice, or some version of my life I haven't dared to see yet. I know the house will come back. It always does. And next time, I don't think I'll be able to resist. So here's my question. If you had a door like that, an invitation to see something you don't fully understand, would you go through it? Or would you walk away and pretend it wasn't there, even if you knew it would never really leave you alone? I was in my garage, digging through old boxes for a power drill when I found it. At first, I thought it was just a mirror, shoved at the bottom of a dusty pile. The glass was grimy, the frame was wooden and cracked, and there was a faint, unreadable word etched at the bottom, worn with time. I might have ignored it completely, but when I leaned down to pull it out, I realized something odd. My reflection didn't match me. It wasn't an obvious difference, just a flicker, a twitch, like it had moved when I hadn't. I stood up straight and stared into the mirror. My reflection stared back. It was me. Same face, same old college hoodie, same exhausted expression I wear every Saturday when I realize I've procrastinated chores for too long. Then, just as I was about to brush it off, the reflection smiled. I didn't. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a rake. What the hell? I whispered to no one. The smile didn't fade. It was slight, like a smirk, but it was unmistakable. My reflection, me, was looking at me like it knew something I didn't, like it had been waiting for this moment. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The reflection was normal now. No smile, no movement, just me, standing in my messy garage. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe the dust was getting to me. I picked up the mirror, intending to carry it out to the trash or donate it or something. when the frame shuddered in my hands. Not violently, just enough to let me know I wasn't imagining it. And then it spoke. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere, soft but clear, like a whisper directly in my ear. "Would you like to trade places?" I dropped the mirror. It landed face up, unbroken despite the fall. "Okay," I muttered, backing away. "This is not happening. This is definitely not happening." The reflection stood up. I froze. It didn't follow my movements. It didn't mirror me at all. It just stood there, perfectly still, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. The reflection's eyes were my eyes, but somehow darker, sharper. Then it tilted its head, slow and deliberate. "You don't like this life, do you?" the voice said. It wasn't coming from the glass. It was inside my head, weaving between my thoughts like a snake. I didn't respond. The reflection stepped closer, toward the edge of the frame. I swear I saw its hands press against the inside of the glass. It was smiling again, but wider this time. Just enough to show teeth. "I can help you," it said. "You can leave it all behind. All I need is a yes." I blinked, the words settling into my brain like dust I couldn't shake. It was insane. Of course I wouldn't say yes. This wasn't real. Mirrors don't talk. But then I thought about my life. My too small apartment, my dead-end job, the bills stacking up on the kitchen counter. I thought about the ache I felt every morning when I woke up, knowing I'd be doing the exact same thing as the day before. What happens if I say yes? I asked before I could stop myself. The reflection grinned. "You'll be free." "Free?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "Free to do what?" The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it raised one hand, extending its fingers like it wanted me to take it. I knelt down, staring into the glass. The reflection, me, but not me, was clearer now. Its face seemed more alive than mine, more vibrant, like it had stolen a little bit of light from the room. "Free," it repeated, softly. I reached out, my hand hovering just above the glass. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was tired of feeling stuck. Maybe I just wanted to believe there was something better waiting for me, even if it was behind a cursed mirror. My fingertips touched the surface. It was cold. The reflection's smile widened. The glass rippled like water, and before I could react, it grabbed my wrist. The hand was real, solid, ice-cold skin pressing into mine as the reflection yanked me forward. I screamed, stumbling to pull away, but it was too strong. My other hand scrabbled against the concrete floor, searching for something to hold on to, but the mirror was pulling me in. My vision blurred, and for a second, everything was upside down. My ears filled with a low humming sound that vibrated through my skull. Then, suddenly, it stopped. I was standing inside the mirror. Everything was backward. The garage, my house, my car. It was all there, but slightly off, like an image through warped glass. The colors were wrong, grayer, darker. My reflection stood on the other side, smiling triumphantly as it adjusted the sleeves of my hoodie. "Don't worry," it said, its voice perfectly mine now. "I'll take good care of it." It turned and walked away, into my life. I pounded against the glass. "Hey, no, get back here." But the glass didn't budge. It didn't even ripple. I tried to step back, but I couldn't. My feet wouldn't move from the spot where I stood. I looked around wildly, searching for something, anything, to help me. That's when I saw them. Other people. There were dozens of them. Maybe hundreds, scattered throughout the warped, gray world, each trapped in their own mirror. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. They were screaming, banging on the glass that surrounded them, but no sound came out. And then I saw her, a woman in a tattered red dress, standing closest to me. She looked up, her face streaked with silent tears, and shook her head slowly. Her mouth moved, forming a single word. "Run." I turned back to my own reflection. It was still there, smiling as it got into my car through the garage door. I screamed, pounded, shouted, but it didn't even look back. And then I heard the humming again. It started faintly, a low vibration coming from deep within the mirror world, growing louder and louder until the floor beneath me began to shake. The other people stopped banging on their mirrors. They were staring at me now, wide-eyed, pointing. The woman in red screamed silently, her hands pressed to her mouth. I turned just in time to see something move in the gray fog behind me. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I could describe. Long, shifting limbs crawled forward, dragging themselves closer, the outline of a massive, faceless body twisting in the distance. It was hungry. I knew it was hungry. I turned and started pounding against the glass. "Let me out," I screamed. "Take me back." I didn't mean it. But the reflection was gone now, living my life. I could feel it out there, laughing, driving my car, eating my food, looking out through my eyes. And I was here, trapped in the glass. I don't know how long I've been in the mirror now. Time doesn't move here, not really. I can still see the world through the glass sometimes. I see myself walking around, living my life better than I ever did. It smiles more than I ever did. It laughs louder. And sometimes, just sometimes, it stops, looks directly into the mirror, and waves. It knows I'm still here. If you ever find an old mirror, one that feels off, do yourself a favor. Leave it alone. And whatever you do, never, ever touch the glass. I found the jar on a Tuesday. It was in the back corner of a thrift store that smelled like dust and stories, tucked behind a stack of mismatched plates and a porcelain clown that stared into my soul. At first glance, it was unremarkable. A squat glass jar with a cork stopper and a faded label that read, in cramped, spidery handwriting, "Do not open." Seriously, I stood there for a second, holding it up to the flickering overhead light, trying to decide if this was a joke or if I'd stumbled into some kind of budget horror movie plot. $5 for that, the woman at the counter said when I brought it over. She looked like someone's great-aunt who had given up on being surprised by anything. No refunds. I didn't even argue. How could I? A jar labeled, "Do not open," is like Chekhov's gun for nosy people like me. I paid in crumpled singles and took it home. The first thing I did when I got back to my apartment was put the jar on the kitchen table and sit across from it like it was a guest I didn't know how to talk to. I leaned closer, trying to see if there was anything inside. But the glass was cloudy, the contents obscured by some kind of dark, swirling mist. I tapped it gently, half expecting it to tap back. Nothing. It was probably empty, just a thrift store gag that had been collecting dust for decades. I should have left it alone. I know that. You know that. Everyone reading this story knows that. But, of course, I didn't. I popped the cork. At first, nothing happened. I sat back, feeling a little let down, like I'd defused a bomb only to find out it was a dud. But then, slowly, the mist began to leak out, thin tendrils curling into the air like smoke from an invisible fire. I froze, watching as it slithered toward the ceiling, pooling there like it was trying to decide what to do next. It smelled faintly of rain and old wood, but underneath that, something sharper, metallic. And then, it spoke. A voice filled the room. Not loud, but so deep I felt it in my bones. Finally, I jumped out of my chair so fast I knocked it over. What the hell was that? The mist coiled tighter in the air, and the voice came again, softer this time, like it was amused. "You opened the jar?" Yeah, obviously. I stammered, my heart hammering. "Who are you? What are you?" The mist pulsed once, like it was thinking. "I am a promise, an agreement, a debt waiting to be paid." That's not an answer, isn't it? The mist swirled lazily, as though it had all the time in the world. Humans always open things they're told not to. It's practically a law of your nature. I didn't. I paused, my brain finally catching up. Wait, are you cursed? Am I cursed now? Not cursed. The mist seemed to stretch, forming faint, twisting shapes. Arms, maybe? A vague suggestion of a face. You have freed me. In exchange, I offer you one gift. One thing you desire. Call it gratitude. I stared at it, hands shaking. You're telling me I get a wish? If that word makes you feel better, then yes. My first instinct was to run screaming out of the apartment. My second instinct was to ask for $1 million, but I'd seen enough movies to know how those things end. There's always a loophole, always a trick. What's the catch? I asked. The mist paused, then whispered, There's always a cost, but that is for later. I didn't like the sound of that. Later when? Later when it matters, the mist replied smoothly. For now, you may ask for anything. Speak your wish. I wanted to say no. I really did. But the words hung on my tongue like a hook, too tempting to resist. I thought about my crappy job, my tiny apartment with the leaky faucet, the way my life felt like it was on a treadmill going nowhere. Anything. All right, I said, exhaling sharply. I wish for freedom. The freedom to do what I want, to go where I want, to live a life that doesn't feel so small. The mist stilled, as though I'd surprised it. Freedom, it repeated. A curious choice. I want to live a life that's mine, I said firmly. No strings, no regrets. The mist pulsed, then began to collapse back into the jar, spiraling like water down a drain. It is done, it said, its voice fading. Enjoy your freedom. The last curl of mist disappeared, and the cork snapped itself back into place with a sound that made me jump. I stared at the jar, now clear and empty, and wondered if I just made the biggest mistake of my life. The first change happened the next morning. I woke up to a phone call from my boss telling me the company had suddenly shut down overnight. You're free, he said, almost cheerfully, as if losing my job was the best thing that had ever happened to me. Weird coincidence, I thought. Unsettling, but weird. By noon, my landlord called to tell me he'd sold the building to a developer, and I had 30 days to move out. You're free to go anywhere, he said with a laugh, like he'd just delivered the punchline to a joke only he understood. I started to panic. The mist's voice echoed in my head. There's always a cost. Over the next week, my life unraveled like a spool of thread rolling downhill. My credit cards froze without warning. My car refused to start no matter how many times I turned the key. Friends stopped returning my calls, and when I tried to visit my parents, their house had somehow been sold to strangers. Everywhere I went, I heard echoes of that word, freedom. People on the street would mutter it in passing conversations. A billboard I swore hadn't been there yesterday read, "Freedom comes with a price." By the end of the week, I had nothing left but the clothes on my back and the jar, which I carried with me because I couldn't bring myself to leave it behind. I wandered the city aimlessly, no job, no home, no ties to anything or anyone. This isn't what I meant. I shouted at the jar one night, sitting under a bridge with the wind howling around me. I didn't ask for this, but the jar stayed silent. That's when I saw it, a flicker of darkness at the edge of the streetlight, the mist seeping out of the jar like smoke curling under a door. It pooled in front of me, rising into the vague suggestion of a shape, its yellow eyes. Yes, it had eyes now, glowing faintly in the dark. You wished for freedom, it said, and I gave it to you. No job, no home, no obligations. You were free, just as you asked. This isn't freedom. I shouted. The mist tilted its head. Isn't it? Or is this what freedom feels like without the things you took for granted? I stared at it, shaking. What do you want from me? Nothing, it said simply. You opened the jar. You wished. And now you have what you asked for. I wanted to scream, to throw the jar into the river and watch it sink, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. So I sat there in the dark, the mist coiling lazily in the air, and tried to remember what my life used to feel like before I'd asked for more. Somewhere in the distance, a train rumbled past. The mist began to pull back, dripping into the jar like ink into a bottle. Choose your words carefully next time, it said softly, as the cork sealed itself shut. I still carry the jar with me because maybe, just maybe, there's a way to fix this. Maybe there's a second wish, a second chance, waiting at the bottom. Or maybe I'll spend the rest of my life carrying my mistake in glass, a constant reminder that freedom, true freedom, was never about having nothing. It was about holding on to what matters. If you ever find a jar like mine, labeled "Do Not Open," take my advice. Don't open it. Seriously. I still don't know why that summer smelled the way it did, like rust and peaches. Maybe it was the water tank on the hill, looming over the town with its chipped blue paint, bleeding iron into the soil. Or maybe it was the fruit stand by the road, the one where the peaches sat in old wicker baskets, their skins soft and fragrant, warmed by the sun. Either way, I can't think about that time without catching that scent, faint and fleeting, like it's hiding in the folds of memory. There was an abandoned house just past the hill. Not the spooky, haunted kind you see in movies, more like the tired kind. Its shutters hung crooked, one of them dangling by a single rusted hinge, and the porch sagged like an old man's shoulders. The paint had peeled so much that the wood underneath looked almost sun-bleached. Everyone in town ignored it, like it was part of the scenery, a feature of the landscape as unremarkable as the water tank. But to me, it wasn't unremarkable at all. To me, it was a portal. I had found it by accident, really. I was 11, bored, and following the kind of vague instincts kids have when they wander. Go left at the strange tree, follow the dirt path with the sharp rocks, keep going until it feels just a little forbidden. The house seemed to rise out of nowhere, tucked behind a tangle of wild blackberry bushes, the kind with thorns that left little pink scratches on your skin if you weren't careful. I stood there for a while that first day, just looking at it, my pulse thudding in my ears like a warning. But the thing about being 11 is that the pull of curiosity almost always wins out over fear. The first time I stepped inside, the air smelled stale, like would rot in dust, but underneath it was something else, something faintly sweet, like honeysuckle. The living room was small, the kind of room that makes you picture soft yellow lamps and crocheted blankets, though all that was gone now. The floor creaked under my sneakers, and I moved carefully, as if the house might wake up and catch me trespassing. The wallpaper was faded, curling at the edges, its once bright pattern of daisies now a muted brown. There was a small table in the corner with a broken leg, propped up awkwardly by a stack of old magazines, their pages warped and yellowed. But what caught my attention most was the piano. It was small and upright, its wood dark and scuffed, the keys unevenly yellowed like an old man's teeth. I don't know why I felt compelled to press one of the keys, but I did. The sound it made was dull and hollow, like a whisper of its former self, but it sent a thrill through me all the same. I pressed another, then another, and for a moment, I could almost imagine what it must have been like when the house was alive. Someone sitting there, their fingers dancing over the keys, the room filled with music and laughter. I started going back to the house every day. It became my secret, my sanctuary. I'd sneak out early in the morning before the heat became unbearable, my backpack stuffed with random treasures, a flashlight, a notebook, a sandwich hastily slapped together with too much peanut butter. I'd sit on the creaky floor by the piano, sometimes drawing in my notebook, other times just listening to the silence. It wasn't empty silence, though. It was the kind of silence that felt full, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. One day, I found the attic. The stairs were narrow and steep, the kind that made you feel like you were climbing into another world. The air up there was thicker, warmer, and it carried that same faint smell of honeysuckle. Sunlight filtered through a small, cracked window, painting the dust motes gold as they swirled lazily in the air. Most of the attic was empty, except for a trunk pushed into the corner. The trunk was covered in a thick layer of dust, and its metal latch was rusted, but it opened easily enough. Inside, I found what I can only describe as someone else's life. There were old photographs, their edges curled and brittle, the people in them smiling in that stiff, formal way people used to smile for cameras. There was a letter, its ink faded to a faint blue, and though I couldn't read most of it, the words, "My dearest Eleanor," stood out like they were meant just for me. There were other things too, small, unremarkable objects that somehow felt significant. A pressed flower, its petals brown and fragile. A pair of baby shoes, scuffed and tiny. A locket with a picture so faded it was just a blur of shapes. I didn't take anything from the trunk, though I wanted to. It felt like a line I couldn't cross, like the things inside belonged to the house as much as the peeling wallpaper or the sagging porch. But I did start to imagine the people who had lived there. I gave them names, stories, lives. In my mind, they were a family. The kind of family that sang around the piano in the evenings, that picked blackberries from the bushes outside and turned them into pies. I imagined their laughter, their arguments, their secrets. It felt like I was piecing together a puzzle, even though I knew I'd never have all the pieces. One day, near the end of summer, I brought Katie with me. She wasn't supposed to know about the house. It was my place. But something about that day made me want to share it. We spent hours exploring, her laughter filling the rooms, making the house feel alive again. She dared me to play the piano, and though I only managed a clumsy version of Chopsticks, it felt like the house approved, like it was grateful for the noise. When we climbed up to the attic, Katie found the trunk right away. She pulled out the photographs, holding them up to the light, her face serious in a way that didn't quite fit her. "Do you think they're still alive?" she asked, and the question hung in the air like the dust motes, heavy and unanswerable. By the time school started again, the house had already started to fade into a memory. The days grew shorter, and my visits became less frequent until they stopped altogether. I don't know why, I just stopped. Maybe it was because Katie and I had stopped talking after a stupid argument about something I can't even remember. Or maybe it was because the magic of the house had done its job, giving me what I needed when I needed it most. Years later, I drove past the hill on a whim, my car kicking up dust on the old road. The house was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and blackberry bushes. I sat there for a long time, the engine idling, the smell of rust and peaches faint in the summer air. I don't know if I felt sad, exactly. More like grateful. Grateful that for one summer, the house had been mine. Grateful that it had let me in. Do you ever think about places like that? Places that don't exist anymore, but still feel like they're a part of you? Diane's hands hovered over the keyboard, her fingers curling and uncurling in hesitation. The email was unfinished, the cursor blinking impatiently in a sea of half-formed sentences. She leaned back in her chair, the faint hum of the office fluorescent lights buzzing in the quiet room. It wasn't the kind of quiet that invited calm. It was the oppressive silence of indecision, of opportunities evaporating in the stillness. The email subject read, "Voluntary relocation opportunities, urgent." Attached was a glossy PDF showcasing pictures of an obscure island, Villeray, tucked away somewhere in the Pacific. The offer was unorthodox, a 2-year contract, housing provided, all for a research initiative she barely understood. But Diane knew why the email had found its way to her. She was a risk-taker, or so everyone claimed. Her decisions had never been governed by logic alone. She closed her laptop without sending the reply, her chair spinning slightly as she got up. Something felt off, not in a foreboding way, but in the manner a diver feels at the edge of a drop-off, peering into water too deep to comprehend. The thought didn't leave her even as she walked home under the haloed glow of streetlights. The plane ride to Villeray was quiet, punctuated only by the turbulence that had caused more than a few passengers to clutch their armrests. Diane wasn't scared. She watched the storm clouds with interest, imagining what it might feel like to simply slip into the clouds, swallowed whole by a sky too vast for ownership. When they landed, the humidity clung to her skin like a damp second layer. Villaray's airport was no more than a repurposed warehouse. A jeep waited outside, its driver, a man with skin weathered like driftwood, holding a sign with her name. She nodded at him, exchanging no words, and climbed into the vehicle. The roads were uneven, the jeep rattling like a shaken tin can. Villages flickered by, their edges guarded by ancient trees that cast long, skeletal shadows. She noticed the children first, barefoot, wide-eyed, waving half-heartedly as the jeep passed. Then the elders, stoic, their faces carved from stone, watching her with a scrutiny that felt like accusation. The research facility was built on the cliffs, overlooking the ocean with an arrogance that only human architecture could muster. Diane was shown her quarters, a sterile, prefabricated structure, and handed an itinerary she didn't bother to read. The walls hummed faintly, the sound of machinery working beneath her feet. Villeray, she would learn, had more secrets buried than displayed. The next morning, she met the team, a mix of scientists, contractors, and a few wildcard consultants whose exact roles were ambiguous. Among them was Nari, a marine biologist with eyes like twin beacons and a voice so calm it could lull a storm to rest. Diane found herself gravitating toward her in the way stars might collapse toward a brighter sun. Nari explained the purpose of the project: to study the bioluminescent flora and fauna unique to Villeray, an ecosystem that defied conventional understanding. But there was more. There was always more. On her third night, Diane woke to the sound of rain battering the metal roof. She thought it was rain until she heard the clicking, sharp, insistent, like pebbles snapping against glass. She sat up, heart racing, and peered out the window. What she saw wasn't rain at all, but thousands of small, glowing creatures clinging to the glass. Their bodies pulsed faintly, a rhythm that felt deliberate, as though communicating in a language her human senses couldn't decode. She watched, transfixed, until they scattered like smoke at the first light of dawn. The creatures became a fixation. Diane spent hours with Nari, cataloging data, hypothesizing wildly, but the others seemed oddly dismissive. "They've been here longer than us," one of the senior researchers muttered during lunch. "Best not to ask questions we don't want answers to." Diane and Nari didn't listen. Their studies took them into the forest, where the air was thick with the smell of moss and rot, and the paths twisted as though alive. The forest hummed, not with insects but with something deeper, something ancient. They found more glowing creatures, some no bigger than a pebble, others the size of a house cat, moving in synchrony, their patterns too intricate to be random. Nari suggested the creatures might be sentient, a theory that earned her hushed whispers and side-eyed glances from the team. One evening, as they stood on the cliffs, watching the ocean devour the setting sun, Nari whispered, "I don't think this place wants us here." Diane laughed nervously. "It's an island, Nari. Islands don't want anything." But her laughter faded when she saw Nari's expression. Serious, resolute. "We're trespassing on something old, Diane. Something patient. And patience doesn't mean tolerance." The unease grew. Equipment malfunctioned inexplicably. Supplies disappeared, only to reappear in strange configurations. Diane woke one night to find her door ajar, despite locking it before bed. But the tipping point came during an offshore dive. Nari led the group to a coral bed teeming with bioluminescent life. Diane marveled at the glowing tendrils, the flickering lights that seemed to whisper in the water's currents. Then, as she reached out to touch one, the lights vanished, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in as the divers fumbled to activate their backup lights. In the sudden glow of her flashlight, Diane caught a glimpse of something massive moving just beyond the edge of visibility, a shadow darker than the abyss itself, studded with faint, flickering lights. They surfaced in silence, their breaths ragged, the air tasting of salt and fear. Back on shore, the team demanded answers, but there were none. Nari stared at the horizon, her face pale, her knuckles white around the straps of her gear. "It's watching us," she whispered. Diane didn't sleep that night. She stood by the window, staring into the dark, half expecting the glowing creatures to return. They didn't, but the absence felt more unsettling than their presence. The following day, Diane found her way to the village, to the elders who watched her with their inscrutable gazes. She asked about the creatures, about the ocean, about what they were truly studying. An old woman, her voice like the crackle of burning leaves, spoke only one word in reply: awakening. The word lingered, heavy and untranslatable. Diane returned to the facility with more questions than answers, a quiet certainty growing in her chest that Villeray was not a place to be understood, but a force to be respected. And as the storms rolled in that night, louder and more furious than before, she couldn't shake the feeling that the island had finally begun to wake. There was a moment, just a sliver of time, where the whole thing could have gone differently. I was on the train, watching the trees blur by in shades of winter gray and brown, wondering why I had chosen to take the scenic route instead of driving. I was supposed to meet some friends for dinner in the city, but I wasn't in the mood for their stories about work promotions or dating dramas. I'd been feeling stuck, caught in the molasses of a routine that left me restless and vaguely hollow. So, when the train stopped at a tiny station I didn't recognize, I stood up and stepped off, surprising even myself. The platform was nearly deserted, save for a man in a bright orange scarf who was pacing back and forth, humming a tune I couldn't place. There was no announcement, no indication of where I was. The station sign had long since faded, its letters barely legible under the grime of decades. I turned to check the train schedule, but there wasn't one. The digital board above the platform just flickered, blank and indifferent. The train behind me hissed, then rolled forward, leaving me alone with the man in the scarf. He stopped pacing and looked at me as though I'd interrupted him mid-thought. "Bit of an odd choice," he said, his voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent I couldn't pin down. I shrugged, unsure of how to respond. "Where am I, exactly?" He tilted his head like I just asked something hilarious. "Depends. Where do you think you are?" I wasn't in the mood for riddles. I scanned the area. A long stretch of overgrown tracks, a dilapidated station house, and beyond that, a town so small it looked like it had been sketched in the margins of someone's notebook. The kind of place you'd miss entirely if you blinked while driving through. "Somewhere I didn't mean to be," I finally replied, stuffing my hands into my coat pockets. He smiled, but it wasn't condescending. It was almost warm, like he knew something I didn't. "Well, if you didn't mean to be here, you probably should be." Before I could ask what that was supposed to mean, he walked away, down the platform and into the town, his orange scarf flapping behind him. I hesitated for a moment, then followed, because what else was I going to do? The town was even smaller up close. A narrow main street with cobblestones that looked slick from the frost, a bakery with a hand-painted sign, a general store, and a cafe with mismatched chairs set up on the sidewalk even though it was far too cold for anyone to sit outside. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon, and the windows of the buildings glowed softly, like every light bulb had been chosen for its ability to make you feel nostalgic for something you couldn't name. I wandered aimlessly, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The few people I saw nodded politely but didn't stop to talk, as if strangers passing through was a perfectly ordinary occurrence. I had the strange sensation that time wasn't moving quite right here, like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something. Eventually, I ended up at the cafe, drawn by the warmth radiating from the windows. Inside, it was small but inviting, with shelves full of books and games, and a radio playing soft jazz in the corner. There was a table near the back where a group of old men were playing cards, their laughter filling the space like it belonged there. At the counter, the man with the orange scarf was ordering tea. "Figured you'd end up here," he said without looking at me. "Do you work for the Chamber of Commerce or something?" I asked, half joking. He chuckled. "Not exactly." I ordered coffee and sat at a table by the window, half watching the street outside and half listening to the card players argue about whether someone had cheated. When the man with the scarf sat down across from me uninvited, I wasn't even surprised. "So," he said, stirring his tea, "what brought you here?" "Bad impulse control." He laughed again, a low, easy sound. "No such thing. Every impulse leads somewhere, and most of them lead exactly where they're supposed to." "And where is this supposed to lead?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled something out of his coat pocket and set it on the table between us. It was a key, heavy and ornate, with a twisted handle that curled into the shape of a star. "What's that for?" "That," he said, "is for you." I picked it up, feeling its weight. "I don't get it." "You don't have to. Not yet." He leaned back in his chair, his orange scarf catching the light from the overhead lamp. "There's a door in this town. This key opens it." "Which door?" He shrugged. "That's the fun part. You have to find it." I should have left right then, handed the key back, and walked out the door to wait for the next train. But there was something about the key, about the way it fit perfectly in my palm, like it had been made for me. "Let me guess," I said, "if I don't find the door, I'm doomed to wander this town forever." "No," he said, standing up and draining the last of his tea. "If you don't find the door, you'll just go back to your life like none of this ever happened. But if you do find it, well, let's just say things might get interesting." Before I could ask anything else, he walked out, leaving me with the key and 100 unanswered questions. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I wandered the town, looking for anything that might resemble a door worth unlocking. Every now and then, I thought I caught a glimpse of the man with the scarf in the distance, but when I tried to follow him, he disappeared. It wasn't until dusk, when the sky turned the color of bruised peaches, that I found it. Tucked away in an alley behind the bakery, barely visible in the fading light, was a small wooden door set into the stone wall. It had no handle, just a keyhole that seemed to shimmer faintly, as if it were alive. I hesitated, the key heavy in my hand. The rational part of me wanted to walk away, to chalk the whole thing up to some elaborate prank or my own overactive imagination. But there was something else, something deeper, that told me I had to open it. So I did. And what I saw on the other side is something I can't fully explain. Not yet, anyway. But let's just say it wasn't anything I could have expected. Have you ever stumbled into something that felt like it was waiting just for you, even if you didn't understand why? It was one of those evenings where everything felt perfectly, wonderfully ordinary. The kind of evening you don't expect to remember 2 weeks later, much less forever. I was walking home from work, cutting through the park like I always did, the weight of my laptop bag pulling against my shoulder. The sun was just starting to set, spilling honey-colored light over the grass and trees, painting the world in a kind of golden haze. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and wildflowers, and the distant sound of someone playing an acoustic guitar drifted lazily toward me from the benches near the fountain. A good evening, but not an extraordinary one. Not yet. About halfway through the park, I noticed a dog. A small, scruffy mutt with wiry fur and a lopsided ear that flopped comically with each step. It was dragging a leash behind it, moving with a kind of frantic determination, like it was on a mission. No owner in sight. My first thought was to find whoever it belonged to, but before I could call out or try to grab the leash, the dog paused, turned its head to look directly at me, and barked once, a sharp, commanding sound. Then it bolted. And here's the part that should have stopped me. A responsible adult would have shrugged it off, told themselves the dog probably belonged to someone nearby, and continued on their way. But something about the way it barked, the way it looked at me, felt oddly personal. Like it wasn't just barking at me, it was summoning me. So, without thinking much about it, I followed. The dog weaved through the park with surprising speed, its leash bouncing behind it like a tail. I kept up as best as I could, apologizing breathlessly to the joggers and families I nearly collided with along the way. We crossed the park, turned down a side street I didn't recognize, and eventually found ourselves in a part of town I'd never seen before. The buildings were taller here, older, their bricks darkened by years of soot and rain. The streets were narrower, cobbled instead of paved, and lined with dimly glowing gas lamps that didn't quite make sense in a modern city. It was the kind of place that felt like it had been forgotten by time, tucked away in some hidden fold of the map. The dog stopped in front of a shop, a tiny, crooked thing wedged between two much larger buildings. Its wooden sign creaked on rusted chains, the paint so faded I could barely make out the words, Hugo's Emporium of Forgotten Things. The windows were grimy, but I could see faint shapes inside. Shelves crowded with odd, mismatched objects, some of them gleaming faintly in the dim light. The dog barked again, once, then scratched at the door with its paw. I hesitated. I had no reason to be there. No rational reason, anyway. But then the door creaked open on its own, and a voice, deep, gravelly, and undeniably human, called out, "Well, don't just stand there. Come in." The dog darted inside without waiting for me, its leash disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a moment longer, wondering if I'd finally lost my mind, then stepped in after it. The door swung shut behind me with a soft click, and the air inside the shop felt different, heavy, like a storm was about to break, but also warm and welcoming, like the first sip of whiskey on a cold night. The man behind the counter, Hugo, I assumed, looked like he'd stepped out of a storybook. He was tall and thin, with wild, silver hair that stuck out in every direction, a pair of tiny spectacles perched on the end of his nose, and a dark velvet coat that had clearly seen better days. He was holding the dog's leash, but the dog had already curled up on a rug in the corner, looking completely at home. "Ah, there you are," Hugo said, peering at me over his spectacles. "Took you long enough." "Me?" I asked, confused. "I don't even know why I'm here." "Your dog." "Not my dog," he interrupted. "Not anyone's dog, really. She just finds people like you. Brings them here when it's time." "Time for what?" I asked, feeling increasingly like I'd stumbled into some bizarre dream. Instead of answering, Hugo reached under the counter and pulled out a small wooden box. It looked ancient, its surface dark with age and covered in strange, intricate carvings. He placed it in front of me and nodded. "Go on. Open it." "I really don't think I should." "Open it," he repeated, his voice gentle but firm. I sighed, because what else could I do at that point? The box was surprisingly light in my hands, its surface warm to the touch. When I opened the lid, I didn't find what I was expecting. No jewels, no ancient relics, no mysterious key. Just a small piece of paper, folded neatly in half. I unfolded it, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a photograph. A photograph of me. Not me as I was now, but me as a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sitting on the front steps of the house I'd grown up in. I was wearing my favorite red sneakers, the ones I'd cried over when I outgrew them, and clutching a stuffed rabbit I hadn't thought about in years. My mother was there, too, sitting next to me, her arm wrapped around my shoulders. She was smiling at the camera, her face full of a warmth and joy I hadn't seen in far too long. She'd passed away when I was 18, and I hadn't realized until that moment how much I missed her smile. "That's impossible," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Not impossible," Hugo said, leaning on the counter with a knowing smile. "Just forgotten. That's what we deal in here. Forgotten things. Memories, moments, pieces of yourself you didn't even know you'd lost." I looked back at the photograph, my hands trembling. It wasn't just a picture. I could feel it, somehow, a tiny spark of the love and safety and innocence I'd felt in that moment. A piece of myself I'd buried so deeply I didn't even know it was gone. What am I supposed to do with this?" I asked. "Whatever you like," Hugo said with a shrug. "Keep it, leave it, trade it for something else. It's yours, after all." I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the photograph, until the sound of the dog barking brought me back to the present. When I looked up, Hugo and the shop were gone. I was standing in the middle of the park, the sun almost fully set, the city around me humming with its usual life. The photograph was still in my hands. To this day, I don't know if any of it was real. The shop, the dog, Hugo, they've never appeared again, no matter how many times I've searched. But the photograph is still with me, tucked into a frame on my nightstand. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and stare at it, wondering what else I've forgotten. The first thing I noticed was the peculiar silence. Not the usual, comfortable quiet of an early morning, where the hum of a refrigerator or the distant chirp of birds might punctuate the stillness, but something sharper. It was as though the air itself had decided to hold its breath. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, and the wooden floor beneath my feet was warm. Not the cozy kind of warmth, but the kind that hinted at something unnatural. The air felt dense, charged, like the static hum before a thunderstorm. That's when I saw it. A single thread of golden light stretching across my bedroom floor. It wasn't coming from the window. The curtains were drawn. The sun hadn't risen yet, and this wasn't sunlight anyway. It had substance, weight, like a thread of silk spun by some impossibly large spider. As I leaned down to touch it, the thread vibrated ever so slightly, as though it had been plucked. A low, resonant hum filled the room, and before I could react, the thread coiled itself around my finger like a living thing. The moment it made contact, the world shifted. My bedroom folded inward like a collapsing tent, walls folding into corners, corners folding into nothing. I was falling, or rather, being pulled, through a kaleidoscope of colors and sounds that had no business existing together. Laughter and thunder. Blue that smelled like burnt sugar. A voice that whispered in the back of my head, "Don't let go." When I finally landed, it wasn't with a thud or a jolt but a strange, fluid softness, like falling into a pool of whipped cream. I was standing in a marketplace, or something like it. Stalls lined the cobblestone street, draped with fabrics that shimmered like oil slicks. The air smelled of cinnamon, lavender, and something metallic, like ozone after lightning. But it wasn't the stalls that caught my attention. It was the vendors. They weren't people. Not entirely. The one closest to me had the body of a man but the face of a fox, his sharp, vulpine eyes following my every move. The stall next to his was manned by something that looked like a living shadow, its edges flickering and shifting like a candle flame. Across the street, a woman with flowers blooming from her hair adjusted the price tags on jars filled with glowing liquid, and they were all staring at me. "New Threadwalker," someone whispered. I turned, but no one was there. Or maybe everyone was. It was hard to tell, as their voices seemed to weave together like the strands of a spider's web. "Careful, careful," another voice murmured. "First step's the hardest." "First step of what?" I blurted, not expecting an answer. To my surprise, the fox-faced man grinned, though his grin was too wide, his teeth too sharp. "First step into the weave," he said. His voice was a low growl, pleasant but predatory. "You've been chosen, haven't you? By the thread?" I glanced down at my hand. The golden thread was still there, now wrapped tightly around my wrist like a bracelet. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. The foxman tilted his head, studying me. "It means you've been pulled into the great weave, the fabric of everything. Every choice, every chance, every life. Threads spinning together into the grandest tapestry. You, my friend, are now a threadwalker. You can pluck at the threads, twist them, knot them, if you're clever. Or," he added with a glint in his eye, "if you're not, you can tangle yourself into oblivion." "Not helpful," I muttered, taking a cautious step back. The thread around my wrist tightened, and the shadow vendor across the street hissed in disapproval. "You're standing still," the shadow said, its voice like a whisper in a cave. "Standing still is dangerous here." "What am I supposed to do?" I asked, exasperated. "Walk," said the flower-haired woman, her voice soft and melodic. "Follow the thread. It will guide you, if you trust it." The thread around my wrist tugged gently, as if responding to her words. Against my better judgment, I let it lead me. The crowd parted as I walked, their eyes following me with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity to something darker. The thread pulled me down the winding cobblestone street, past stalls selling things I couldn't begin to describe, jars of captured laughter, cages filled with tiny storms, mirrors that reflected not your face but your deepest secrets. At one point, I passed a stall where the vendor, a creature with wings like stained glass, was arguing with a customer over the price of a bottled memory. "This one's a first kiss," the vendor protested. "Do you have any idea how rare those are?" The customer, a woman with scales running down her arms, sniffed dismissively. "It's a first kiss from a bad date. The value's depreciated." I barely had time to process what I was seeing before the thread tugged again, pulling me toward the edge of the marketplace. The stalls thinned out, replaced by open fields of tall, silver grass that shimmered like liquid mercury. The sky above was a swirling canvas of colors, shifting and bleeding into one another like wet paint. And in the distance, I saw it. A loom the size of a mountain, its massive wooden beams creaking as unseen hands wove threads of light and shadow into an endless tapestry. The thread around my wrist pulled me closer, and I realized with a mix of awe and dread that the tapestry was alive. Images flickered across its surface, people laughing, crying, fighting, falling in love. Entire lives played out in seconds before dissolving into the larger pattern. I reached out, compelled, and the thread around my wrist leapt toward the loom, weaving itself into the fabric. The moment it touched, I felt everything. Every life, every thread, every choice made and unmade. It was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying, and for a moment, I thought I might dissolve into it. But then the thread pulled me back, grounding me, anchoring me. The tapestry rippled where my thread had joined, a small, golden knot glowing faintly against the larger pattern. "Welcome to the weave," the foxman said, suddenly beside me. His grin was still sharp, but there was something almost kind in his eyes. "You've made your first knot. Now the real work begins." I stared at the tapestry, at the endless threads stretching into eternity, and felt a strange, electric thrill. "What happens next?" I asked. The foxman chuckled. "That, Threadwalker, is entirely up to you. If you could pull at the threads of fate, Change the pattern of the world. What's the first thing you try to weave? When I opened my fridge to grab some milk for my cereal, I didn't expect to find a man in a three-piece suit sitting inside it. He wasn't shivering, which I thought was odd, considering it's a fridge and not, say, a heated recliner. He was perched between the egg carton and a tub of butter, legs crossed like he was at a casual brunch, reading a tiny newspaper. And not just any newspaper. A tiny one, like dollhouse-sized, with headlines in a font so small, I'm sure only ants could read it. He looked up at me over the rim of his glasses and sighed, like I was the one inconveniencing him. Ah, finally, he said, folding his microscopic paper and tucking it into the pocket of his very well-tailored jacket. Took you long enough. His voice was crisp, British, and slightly condescending, as though I'd kept him waiting for hours, which, let's be clear, I absolutely had not. I'd only just woken up, and I was certain my fridge had been human-free the night before. What? Who? Why are you in my fridge? I managed to stammer, still holding the cereal box like it might offer me some kind of emotional support. He waved his hand dismissively, as though this question was entirely beneath him. Fridge logistics aren't important right now, he said. What is important is that you've been selected. Congratulations, by the way. Not many people get chosen. He reached into the butter tub, pulled out a tiny clipboard, and started flipping through what looked like a stack of post-it notes. Name. Your name. Occupation. Questionable. Aptitude for nonsense. Promising. Yes, you'll do nicely. Selected for what? I asked, but he ignored me and snapped his fingers. Suddenly, the fridge wasn't a fridge anymore. It was an elevator. And not your standard elevator either. It was lined with shelves full of condiments, jars of pickles, and a single, lonely can of whipped cream that kept rolling around. The man hit a button labeled, "Somewhere else," and the doors slid shut with a cheerful ding. This can't be safe, I muttered, clutching the cereal box tighter as the elevator jolted into motion. You can't just convert someone's fridge into a whatever this is. You'd be surprised what I can do, he replied smugly. Now listen carefully, because I won't repeat myself. He straightened his tie, leaned against a jar of mustard, and said, You're being sent to the pantryverse. The what now? The pantryverse, he repeated, exasperated. It's an interdimensional realm where, look, it's hard to explain. Imagine if all the snacks and food in the world had their own little kingdoms and economies and politics. That's the pantryverse, and they're in trouble. This was about the point where I started to seriously question my mental health. So you're telling me, I said slowly, that there's a universe full of sentient snacks? And other culinary oddities, he added, as if this was perfectly reasonable. Vegetables, beverages, the occasional rogue spice rack. It's a surprisingly diverse ecosystem. Before I could decide whether to laugh, scream, or ask if I was on a hidden camera show, the elevator doors opened with another cheerful ding. What lay beyond was, well, it was definitely not my kitchen. The ground was made of what looked like graham crackers, the sky swirled with streaks of cotton candy, and in the distance, I could see a towering castle made entirely of breadsticks. A river of melted chocolate wound through the landscape, and a herd of marshmallows was grazing nearby. One of them looked up and bleated at me like a sheep. Right, I said, taking a deep breath. This is fine. Everything is fine. It's not fine, the man said, stepping out of the elevator and gesturing for me to follow. That's why you're here. The pantryverse is on the brink of collapse, and you've been chosen to save it. Why me? I asked, because frankly, I didn't feel particularly qualified to rescue an entire snack-based dimension. I didn't even remember to bring reusable bags to the grocery store most of the time. Because you're human, he said simply, as though that explained everything. Humans are unpredictable. You're like wild cards in a very, very boring deck. And right now, we need unpredictability. We started walking toward the breadstick castle, which I noticed was guarded by what looked like very serious pretzel sticks armed with tiny spears. Along the way, the man explained that the pantryverse was under siege by the Frosting King, a tyrannical ruler who had discovered a way to freeze everything in place, including time itself. If he succeeds, the man said gravely, Everything will be stuck in stasis forever. No more baking, no more cooking, no more snacking. Just endless, flavorless limbo. Okay, but what am I supposed to do about it? I asked, sidestepping a puddle of what I hoped was caramel. That, he said, stopping and turning to face me, is entirely up to you. Like I said, unpredictability. Maybe you'll negotiate. Maybe you'll start a rebellion. Maybe you'll invent a new flavor of ice cream that's so delicious, it melts his frosty heart. Who knows? Before I could respond, a shadow fell over us. I looked up to see a massive, hulking figure made entirely of frosting. He had a crown of candy canes, eyes like molten sugar, and a sneer that could curdle milk. The Frosting King. He pointed a gooey finger at me and rumbled, "Who dares to challenge me?" The man in the suit gave me a little shove forward. "Good luck," he said brightly before vanishing into thin air. So there I was, standing face to face with a literal mountain of frosting, armed with nothing but a cereal box and a vague sense of doom. And you know what? I did what any reasonable person would do in that situation. I held up the box and said, "Have you tried this? It's great with milk." The Frosting King paused, his sugary glare softening ever so slightly. What kind of cereal?" he asked, his voice losing some of its thunderous menace. "It's, honey and oat," I said, shaking the box a little. "Very wholesome. Good source of fiber." And that's how I ended up sitting on the edge of a graham cracker hill, sharing a bowl of cereal with the Frosting King while we discussed the finer points of balanced breakfast options. It turns out he wasn't so bad once you got past the whole evil dictator vibe. Apparently, all he really wanted was for people to appreciate frosting as more than just a topping. By the time the man in the suit reappeared to check on me, the Frosting King had agreed to step down in exchange for a National Frosting Appreciation Day. "Unpredictable," the man said, nodding approvingly as he escorted me back to the elevator. "I knew you'd be perfect." When I got home, my fridge was back to normal. But every time I see a tub of frosting in the grocery store, I can't help but wonder if it's watching me. And if you opened your fridge tomorrow to find a tiny man in a suit sitting between the leftovers, what would you do? The train station near my apartment is one of those sprawling, utilitarian places that seem indifferent to human presence. Everything about it feels temporary, from the metal benches that are cold no matter the season to the cracked announcements over the intercom, always warning of delays and voices that sound more tired than apologetic. Commuters move through it with the same energy as beads of water running downhill, pulled by gravity toward the next destination. Nobody lingers here by choice. It's the kind of place where the goal is to arrive and leave as quickly as possible, to exist only in transit. But last night, something broke that rhythm. I'd just gotten off the late train from work, my mind heavy with the usual clutter of deadlines and meetings, when I noticed a man standing near one of the out-of-service ticket machines. He wasn't pacing impatiently like most people stuck in a delay or staring blankly at his phone like the rest of us. He was holding something, a plain white box, small enough to cradle in both hands. It looked like one of those generic bakery boxes, the kind tied up with thin red and white string. What made me stop wasn't the box but the way he was holding it, with this strange, almost reverent focus. His hands were steady, his grip firm but careful, as though whatever was inside was fragile, or precious, or both. He didn't look nervous, just purposeful, like he was waiting for something, or someone, and had built his entire evening around this single moment. There was no one else near him, though, and he didn't seem to notice the stream of people brushing past him on their way to the exits. I leaned against a pillar, pretending to check my messages, but really, I was watching him. His suit was slightly wrinkled, the way clothes get when someone's been moving around all day, but he had this energy about him that was oddly composed, like he'd been saving up all his focus for this one task. He glanced at the clock mounted high on the wall, and I followed his gaze. The hands hadn't even reached 10 yet, but the station was already emptying out, late enough for most people to be home, early enough that it didn't feel like the end of the world to still be out. I wondered why he wasn't leaving. Just when I started to think I'd imagined the weight of the moment, that maybe he was just a guy holding a box and nothing more, someone appeared at the far end of the platform. A woman, young, dressed in a heavy winter coat that looked a size too big. She was walking fast, her boots making quick, sharp clicks against the tile. As soon as he saw her, he shifted slightly, straightening his back and stepping forward with this awkward half-confidence, like he was both sure of what he was doing and terrified of it at the same time. I couldn't hear what they said when she reached him, but I didn't need to. The way she stopped, the way her face softened into an expression I couldn't quite read, told me that this wasn't just an ordinary meeting. He handed her the box, and she took it without hesitation. For a moment, they stood there, both holding it together, neither one letting go. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I saw her head tilt slightly, her brow furrowing just enough to suggest surprise or curiosity. He said something then, a few short words that seemed to land with enough weight to pull the moment taut. She let go of the box, but instead of opening it, she just held it the way he had, carefully, like it was more than it appeared to be. Then, in a gesture so quick I almost missed it, she reached out and squeezed his arm. A brief touch that seemed to carry an entire conversation. She smiled, faint and fleeting, before turning and walking away, the box still in her hands. He stood there for a moment longer, staring after her, then exhaled in a way that suggested he'd been holding his breath for hours. He didn't follow her. He just watched until she disappeared through the far doors, then turned and walked toward the opposite end of the station, his pace slow, deliberate. I couldn't move for a few seconds. Something about the scene had left me frozen in place, as though the air around them had thickened and I'd gotten caught in it. My brain immediately started building stories to fill in the gaps. Was it a gift? A peace offering? Some long-awaited gesture that he'd finally mustered the courage to make? And why had she looked at him the way she did? Like she'd been waiting for this, but wasn't sure what to do now that it had happened. On the way home, I kept replaying it in my mind, unable to shake the feeling that I'd witnessed something deeply significant, even if I didn't know what it was. It's strange how moments like that can cling to you, how they can feel heavier than your own memories. I started imagining what might have been in the box. Something simple, like pastries from her favorite bakery, or something complicated, like an envelope with an explanation too long for words. Maybe it was symbolic, an inside joke between them, or maybe it was something entirely practical, like her forgotten gloves or a book she'd lent him months ago. I'll never know, of course, but the mystery of it somehow makes it better. What I can't stop thinking about, though, is the quiet intensity of the whole exchange. It felt like watching a play where the dialogue has been stripped away, leaving only the gestures, the expressions, the charged silence. Whatever passed between them wasn't meant for anyone else to understand, but for a moment, it was visible to everyone passing through the station. And then, just like that, it was gone, folded back into the mundane rhythm of people coming and going, rushing to make trains or waiting for the next one. Now, every time I see someone carrying a box like that, or waiting for someone with that same kind of quiet, unshakable focus, I wonder what's happening in their world. How many stories are unfolding in plain sight, unnoticed because we're all too busy rushing past them? It's strange to think about how much of life we miss simply because we assume it's unimportant, just another person waiting at a station or holding something that seems ordinary. So, I have to ask, have you ever stumbled onto a moment like that? Something private and unspoken, caught in the middle of the everyday chaos that stayed with you long after it was over? Because sometimes, I think those are the moments that remind us just how much we don't know about the lives happening around us. And honestly, I think that's kind of beautiful. You know those mornings when you wake up, and for a moment, everything feels off? Not someone rearranged the furniture off, but like the world you woke up in is wearing its shirt backward. That's how my Tuesday started. Except it didn't feel like Tuesday either. I rolled over, expecting to see the usual pile of laundry glaring at me from the chair. But instead, I found myself staring at what can only be described as a sentient cloud wearing glasses. And it wasn't just any cloud. It had this patient, slightly annoyed schoolteacher vibe. Before I could open my mouth to scream, or maybe apologize for being underdressed, it raised one fluffy arm, "Do clouds have arms?" and handed me a steaming cup of coffee. "You'll need this," it said in a voice like soft thunder. Now, let me tell you something. If you've never accepted coffee from a talking cumulonimbus, you're missing out. I don't know what it brewed that coffee with. Lightning? Sunshine? Hopes and dreams. But it was, hands down, the best coffee I've ever had. It could have been piping hot regret in a mug, and I still would have asked for seconds. So, I took a sip, trying to process the whole Cloud Butler scenario, when it floated closer and said, "We're running late. Don't forget your hat." My hat? I don't even own a hat. But before I could question it, the cloud snapped what I assume were its fingers, and a bowler hat materialized on my head. Then it happened. The bed I was sitting on, my very boring, solid, dependable bed, shivered like a cat stepping into a puddle and stood up. On 4 intricately carved wooden legs. It turned its headboard toward me, blinked its pillow eyes, and said, "Hold on tight." The next thing I knew, we were galloping out of my bedroom and down a cobblestone path that definitely wasn't there last night. The walls of my apartment had vanished. Instead, I was in this enormous, sunlit meadow filled with oversized wildflowers that seemed to hum a little tune when the wind blew through them. And there, just ahead, was the kind of carnival you only see in movies, or dreams after eating too much cheese. The cloud, who I had now mentally named Carl, because if a cloud hands you coffee, it deserves a name, floated alongside me as my bed cantered toward the carnival gates. The gates themselves were an impressive mix of neon lights, stained glass, and what looked suspiciously like giant candy canes. "Remember," Carl said in his gentle rumble, "you only have until sunset." Sunset? Until what? I tried to press for details, but he just gave me that same patient look, as if explaining the obvious to a slightly dim child. "The rules are the rules," he said cryptically, before handing me a ticket made entirely of spun sugar. It melted a little in my hands as I stared at it. As soon as I passed through the gates, everything smelled like popcorn, fresh rain, and that weirdly specific scent of happiness you get from opening a new book. The carnival was packed. Not with people, exactly, but with creatures and characters that felt like they'd walked out of the doodles you used to draw in the margins of your school notebooks. There was a penguin selling snow cones from a floating iceberg, a line of sentient teacups waiting for the carousel, and a tree handing out balloons from its branches. I was just starting to wonder if maybe I'd been abducted by aliens with a flair for whimsical nonsense when a small, mechanical fox in a bow tie approached me. It held out a velvet pouch and said, "Choose wisely." Inside the pouch were 3 marbles. One glittered like starlight, another shimmered like liquid gold, and the last looked like it contained an actual storm cloud. "One of these will show you the future," the fox explained. "One will let you change the past, and the other is just decorative." Before I could ask for more clarification, or, let's be honest, a refund, the fox tipped its little hat and scampered off, leaving me holding the pouch like some kind of budget fantasy protagonist. Naturally, I panicked. I mean, what if I picked the decorative one? Or worse, what if I picked the storm cloud and it electrocuted me? And where was Carl? He seemed like the kind of cloud who'd know a thing or two about magical marbles. After way too much internal debate, I chose the glittering starlight marble because, let's face it, who doesn't want to see the future? The moment I touched it, the carnival froze. Like everything. The teacups stopped spinning mid-air, the popcorn kernels hovered in place, and even the wind seemed to pause. Then, without warning, the marble projected a hologram of me in the middle of a dramatic sword fight with what appeared to be a sentient baguette. I'm talking full-on swashbuckling, pirate movie levels of swordplay, except instead of swords, I was wielding a giant spoon. Future me looked absolutely unbothered by the absurdity of it all, which honestly raised more questions than it answered. When the vision faded, everything snapped back to normal. Or, as normal as a carnival staffed by penguins and trees can be. I was about to go demand some answers from Carl, but then the carousel started playing Bohemian Rhapsody on a pipe organ, and I got distracted. By the time I remembered I was supposed to be questioning my life choices, the sun had started to set. Carl floated over, his glasses slightly askew, and said, "Time's up." Before I could argue or ask if the bed knew how to reverse gallop, the whole scene started to dissolve like watercolors in the rain. I woke up back in my apartment, the bowler hat still perched on my head, and a faint smell of popcorn lingering in the air. Carl was gone, But the coffee cup he'd given me was sitting on my nightstand, empty but warm to the touch. And there, tucked under it, was the velvet pouch with the 3 marbles. The storm cloud one buzzed faintly when I picked it up. So now I'm sitting here, staring at these marbles and wondering, if you had one day in a world like that, where the rules make no sense, but everything feels oddly perfect, what would you do? Would you pick the starlight marble, the storm cloud, or just embrace the chaos and keep riding the bed until it takes you somewhere even stranger? I first noticed the man in the hat when I looked at my reflection in a department store window. I wasn't paying attention, just sort of glancing as I walked past, when something in the glass caught me mid-step. There he was, a tall man in an old-fashioned hat and a long gray coat, standing just a few paces behind me. Not walking, not moving, just standing there. I turned around sharply to see who it was. Nothing. The sidewalk behind me was empty. A couple of kids on scooters rolled by, and a guy with headphones shuffled past, but no one in a hat. I frowned and turned back to the window, but my reflection was normal again. Just me, staring awkwardly at a mannequin wearing a sequin dress. "Get it together," I muttered, shaking my head as I walked on. It was probably some weird trick of the light, something with the way the glass warped reflections. But I saw him again 2 days later, this time in the mirror at my gym. I was alone in the locker room, toweling off my hair, when I caught movement in the far edge of the mirror. The man in the hat. Same long coat, same still posture, same complete lack of expression. Just watching. I spun around so fast I almost slipped, heart pounding, but the locker room was empty. My towel fell to the floor as I backed up a step, scanning every corner. "Hello?" My voice echoed off the tile, making me feel ridiculous. "Is anyone here?" No answer. Nothing but the hum of the fluorescent lights. I turned back to the mirror, bracing myself, but he was gone. This was the part where most people would probably call a therapist or a priest, but I decided it was stress. Work had been insane. I wasn't sleeping well, and my brain was probably throwing shadows at me as a twisted form of entertainment. "You're fine," I told myself out loud, trying not to feel like I was lying. "You're fine. Just tired." That night, I dreamed of him. I was standing in my living room, the windows wide open, curtains billowing in some wind I couldn't feel. I turned toward the dark hallway leading to my bedroom, and there he was, the man in the hat, standing perfectly still at the edge of the shadows. His face was blurred, like a smudged photo, but I could feel his eyes on me. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, with every light in my apartment flickering. The clock on my nightstand read 3:13 a.m. I turned on every lamp, every overhead light, even the TV for good measure. The apartment felt colder than usual, like something had walked through it. I didn't go back to sleep. For the next week, he started appearing everywhere. I saw him in the reflection of car windows as I walked past, in the darkened screen of my phone before it powered on, in puddles of rainwater on the sidewalk, standing across the street in a place where no one stood. Always watching, always still. The worst part wasn't that he was there. The worst part was that no one else could see him. I tested it once while having coffee with my friend Lisa. We were sitting at a little cafe with large mirrored panels on the wall, and there he was, reflected right behind me. "Lisa," I said quietly, trying to sound calm, "do you see that guy? The one in the coat? Right behind me?" She glanced over my shoulder and frowned. "What guy?" "The one. Right there." I gestured at the mirror. Her brow furrowed. "Dude, are you okay? There's nobody there." I looked back at the mirror, and sure enough, he was still there, hat tilted slightly, almost like he knew I was pointing him out. I turned to face the spot directly, and, of course, there was no one there. When I turned back, he was closer in the reflection, just a little closer, like he'd taken a step forward. "Never mind," I said quickly, feeling cold sweat bead on the back of my neck. I stopped looking at mirrors after that, or reflections of any kind. I covered the bathroom mirror with a towel. I kept my phone face down. I avoided store windows and shiny cars. I walked with my head down, focusing on my shoes, convinced that if I didn't look, he couldn't follow me. But you can't avoid reflections forever. They're everywhere. Windows, water, glass, even people's eyes. It happened 3 nights ago. I was brushing my teeth before bed when I realized I'd left my phone on the counter. I picked it up and its screen, black and darkened, reflected back a faint outline. He was standing behind me, in my apartment. I froze. My fingers trembled as I slowly turned around, toothbrush still clenched in my mouth. The bathroom was empty, but I could feel him there. Close. So close. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. I drove for hours, staying off main roads, barely stopping for gas or food. I booked a motel room that night in the middle of nowhere, checked in without looking anyone in the eye, and locked myself inside with all the curtains drawn tight. It didn't matter. In the middle of the night, I woke up with my heart pounding, my mouth dry. The room felt heavy, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. I glanced at the small, square mirror hanging on the wall opposite the bed and instantly regretted it. He was there, sitting in the chair at the edge of the room. This time, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stood up and turned to face me. The brim of his hat cast a long shadow over his face, but I could see the faintest suggestion of a grin, wide, unnatural, like it had been carved there. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only stare as he lifted one gloved hand and raised a single finger to his lips. Shoo. The next morning, the motel manager knocked on the door, asking why I hadn't checked out yet. They found me sitting on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, staring blankly at the mirror. I don't remember how I got there. I don't remember much of anything, really, except the sound of footsteps in the dark and the way he grinned at me like he knew something I didn't. They let me go after a while, probably because I didn't say much, just kept muttering about staying away from mirrors. I don't think they believed me. They didn't see the man in the hat, but I see him. He's always there now, waiting just behind the glass. He doesn't move often, but sometimes he'll tilt his head, just slightly, like he's curious about how long I can keep running. I don't know what he wants or why he picked me, but I know this. Once you've seen him, he doesn't let you go. And if you ever catch a glimpse of something in the corner of your reflection, something tall, something still, something wearing a hat, do yourself a favor. Don't look back. I first noticed the cat on a Tuesday. It sat perfectly still at the corner of ash and pine, like a statue someone had carved out of shadow. Its fur was so black it seemed to swallow the light. Its eyes 2 points of glowing green that fixed on me as I passed. At first, I thought nothing of it. Cities are full of stray cats. I gave it a nod, the way you do when you meet a cat that looks like it knows something you don't, and kept walking. But when I turned the corner, there it was again. Sitting beside a lamppost, its tail curled neatly around its paws, staring at me like it was waiting. I stopped, looking back the way I'd come. The street was empty. There was no way it could have gotten ahead of me, and yet, there it was. I took a step forward. So did the cat. I took a step back. The cat didn't move. "All right," I muttered, feeling foolish for talking to a stray. "What's your deal?" The cat blinked slowly, as if considering my question, then stood and darted down an alleyway to my left. It paused at the entrance, looking back at me expectantly. I don't know why I followed it. Maybe it was the way it looked at me, like it was issuing a challenge. Maybe it was curiosity, that whisper of what if that lives in all of us. Either way, I turned and walked into the alley, my footsteps echoing between the old brick walls. The alley was longer than it should have been, stretching out like a corridor that didn't belong. The deeper I went, the quieter the city became, until the only sound was the faint scrape of my shoes against the pavement. The cat stayed just ahead of me, slipping through puddles of shadow and light, always moving forward, never looking back. After what felt like miles, the alley ended at a door. The door was ordinary, unmarked, made of weathered wood with peeling green paint. A single brass knocker shaped like a hand jutted from its center. The cat sat beside it, staring at me, its eyes reflecting the faint light like 2 coins at the bottom of a well. I reached for the knocker, and the cat meowed softly, almost encouragingly, as though I'd passed some invisible test. I knocked 3 times. The sound was muffled, swallowed immediately by the stillness around me. The door creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I turned to look at the cat, half expecting it to disappear, but it just tilted its head as if to say, "Go on, then." So I stepped through. At first, I couldn't see anything. The darkness was so thick it felt solid, pressing against me like water. Then, slowly, a faint light bloomed in the distance, followed by the sound of soft, rhythmic clicking, like 100 clocks ticking at once. I walked toward the light, and as I did, the darkness began to peel away. I found myself in a room, a vast, circular chamber with walls that stretched up into shadows so high I couldn't see the ceiling. The walls were covered with clocks, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, all shapes and sizes, from ornate grandfather clocks to tiny pocket watches suspended on chains. They clicked and ticked and whirred in perfect harmony, their hands moving at different speeds, some fast, some slow, others frozen altogether. The air smelled faintly of metal and dust, like the inside of an old watch. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat a glass jar. Inside the jar was a key, and beside it stood a man. He looked normal enough at first glance, tall, neatly dressed in a dark suit, but his face was obscured, not by a mask or shadow, but by something else. It was like looking at a reflection in a rippling pond. Blurry, always shifting, impossible to pin down. "You're late," the man said, his voice calm and clipped, like a clockmaker patiently scolding an apprentice. "Late for what?" I asked, feeling absurd. He gestured to the clocks. "Everything has its time, including you." I looked around, trying to make sense of it all. "What is this place?" "The Between," he replied. "A place of moments, of choices, of doors." I turned my gaze back to the pedestal. "What's the key for?" He tilted his head, and I swore I saw a flicker of a smile ripple across his face. "You already know." The key in the jar pulsed faintly, as if it were alive, its surface glinting gold one second and silver the next. Without thinking, I reached for the jar, but the man moved suddenly, and his hand shot out to stop me. His touch was cold, unnaturally still. "Be certain," he said, his tone heavier now, almost warning. "The key opens one door, but locks another. That is its price." "What do you mean?" "You'll see." He released me, stepping back into the shadows, leaving me alone with the key. I turned to look at the clocks again, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. Some of the clocks bore my name etched into their faces, their hands ticking towards some unknowable hour. Others were blank, their glass fogged and empty. I realized, with a cold shiver, that these clocks were lives, paths I could have taken, moments I had missed, doors I had opened or ignored. The ticking grew louder, like a heartbeat, and the key pulsed brighter inside the jar. I knew, somehow, that I couldn't stay here. The longer I lingered, the more the clocks would pull at me, weaving me into their endless rhythm until I was just another tick among thousands. I grabbed the jar. The glass was warm against my hands, and as I lifted the lid, the key fell into my palm. Instantly, the room began to shift. The clocks stuttered, their ticking fracturing into chaos, the walls warping like melting wax. The man's voice echoed one last time through the chamber. "Choose your door wisely." The floor beneath me cracked open, and I fell. Not down, exactly, but through time, through space, through memories that weren't mine. I landed hard, gasping, back in the alley where I'd started. The door was gone, the cat too, but the key was still in my hand, heavy and cold. The street around me was quiet, empty, as though nothing had happened at all. But when I looked closer, the shadows seemed to stretch just a little longer, the air felt a little thicker, and I realized something had shifted. I don't know what the key unlocks, or what door I'll have to open next. But the cat watches me now. Sometimes it's perched on a rooftop, its green eyes glowing in the dark. Other times, I see it reflected in mirrors or waiting just out of reach, tail twitching like it's impatient. And every now and then, I hear it again. That faint, rhythmic ticking, like 100 clocks counting down to something I don't yet understand. The whole thing started with a crack in the sidewalk. I'd walked over it hundreds of times before, on my way to work, on lazy Sunday strolls, on late-night runs to the corner store when my fridge held nothing but mustard and regret. But that morning, something was different. Maybe it was the way the sun hit it, casting a sharp, slanting beam of light that drew my attention. Or maybe it was just one of those moments where the universe nudges you and says, "Hey, look closer." The crack wasn't special at first glance, just a jagged line splitting two concrete slabs, dark and shadowy in the morning light. But when I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The crack wasn't just a crack. It was moving. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was still half asleep or my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I knelt down, I saw it. The faintest ripple along the edges of the crack, like a heartbeat under skin. The hair on my arms stood up. Great, I muttered to myself. I've officially lost it. Too much coffee. Or not enough. I glanced up, hoping someone else might be walking by so I could say, "Hey, do you see this? Or am I losing my mind?" But the street was empty. Just the hum of distant traffic and the rustle of wind through dry leaves. The crack rippled again. This time, something happened. A sound, faint but unmistakable, rose from beneath the concrete. A soft, hollow click-click-click, like nails tapping gently against glass. I stood up so fast I nearly fell over, my pulse thundering in my ears. Logic tried to calm me down. It's probably just the pipes or something underground. But my gut disagreed. I didn't know what I just heard, but it wasn't plumbing. I should have walked away. I should have ignored it and gone to work like a normal person. But curiosity is a trap, and I fell right into it. I knelt down again, heart pounding, and whispered, "Hello?" The crack stopped moving. For one long, horrible second, nothing happened. Then, just as I started to think maybe I really had lost it, something whispered back, "Hello." The voice was small, fragile, like a child's, but it didn't sound right. It was hollow, like it had traveled a very long way to reach me, bouncing off walls I couldn't see. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my bag, and looked around again, half expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" But the street was still empty, and now it was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just me and the crack. Did you just talk?" I asked, feeling ridiculous. There was silence, and then the voice whispered, "I'm stuck." I froze. "What?" "Please," the voice said, faint and broken, like it was trying very hard to hold itself together. "Help me. I can't get out." It sounded so close, like whoever, or whatever, was speaking was just beneath the sidewalk, reaching for me. I took another step back, shaking my head. Nope, 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 nope. I wasn't about to start digging into a sentient crack in the sidewalk. I turned on my heel and power walked away, refusing to look back even as the whisper followed me. "Don't leave me here." The voice faded as I rounded the corner, but it stuck with me all day. I tried to focus at work, bury myself in spreadsheets and emails, but I couldn't shake the sound. That small, broken voice, pleading. By lunchtime, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, Googled "weird crack in sidewalk talking to me," and predictably found nothing useful. Just old conspiracy forums and unhinged blog posts from people who believed sidewalks were alive. I was spiraling, and I knew it. By the time I left work, the rational part of my brain had lost the battle. I didn't even fight it. My feet carried me straight back to the crack, like I'd been tethered to it all day. The street was darker now, the setting sun turning the world gold and gray. I stood there, staring at the crack, feeling equal parts terrified and ridiculous. It was still moving, barely, just a faint ripple. I knelt down again, my breath fogging in the cool air. "Who are you?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, "I don't know." The voice sounded smaller now, weaker. "What do you mean, you don't know?" I asked. "How can you not know?" "It's dark here," the voice replied. "I've been here so long. I forget." My hands started to shake. I wasn't cold, but I felt cold, like the air around the crack was leaching warmth from me. "What do you want?" "To get out," the voice said. "Please, you can help me." "How?" There was a pause. Then, "Pull it open." I blinked. "What?" "Pull the crack open. Just a little. I'll be free." This was insane. I knew that, but I reached out anyway, pressing my fingers against the concrete. It was warm, too warm, and it moved, shuddering faintly under my hands, like something alive. "Please," the voice whispered. I don't know what possessed me, but I curled my fingers around the jagged edge of the crack and pulled. At first, nothing happened, but then the concrete shifted, groaning like old wood, and the crack widened. I gasped and let go, stumbling back as something dark poured out of it, like smoke but heavier, thicker. It coiled upward, slithering into the air, and as I stared, frozen in place, the voice came again. "Thank you." But it didn't sound small anymore. It was deeper, louder, and it was behind me. I turned, heart in my throat, and saw it. The darkness had taken shape. A tall, thin figure standing at the edge of the street, its body rippling like oil. Its face was smooth and blank, except for its mouth, which stretched impossibly wide in a grin. "I've been waiting," it said. Its voice no longer broken, but full and hungry. My legs finally remembered how to move. I turned and ran, sprinting down the street, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, locked the door behind me, and sank to the floor, gasping for air. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every shadow, every faint whisper of wind made my skin crawl. I kept expecting to hear it again. "I'm stuck?" But I didn't. The next morning, I forced myself to walk back to the crack. It was gone. The sidewalk was smooth and unbroken, like nothing had ever happened. But the air felt wrong, too still, too heavy, and when I leaned down, I swore I could feel warmth radiating from the ground, like something was still there, waiting. I don't walk that way anymore. I take the long route to work, crossing the street whenever I get close to where the crack used to be. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, just faintly. A soft, rhythmic click-click-click that sounds like nails tapping gently against glass. And I know it's looking for another crack. Whenever I fall for someone, they start to glow. Not in the metaphorical sense like, oh, they light up the room. I mean, they actually glow. A soft, pulsing light clings to their edges, like they've been outlined in gold ink. It's faint at first. So faint I always wonder if I'm seeing things. But the more I like them, the brighter they get. By the time I'm full-on crushing, the glow is undeniable, a warm, golden aura that follows them everywhere they go. The first time it happened, I was 12. My best friend Amelia and I were climbing trees in her backyard, and for the first time, I realized I liked her more than just a friend. It was like flipping a switch in my brain. Suddenly, Amelia glowed. Her hair caught the sunlight even when she was standing in the shade. Her freckles shimmered faintly, like constellations under her skin. At first, I thought it was some weird trick of my eyes, so I squinted, rubbed them, even tried blinking it away. "What are you doing?" she asked, laughing, sitting there on her branch like a small, perfect sunbeam. I didn't answer. I couldn't. How was I supposed to explain that she was glowing like a streetlight in the dusk? As I got older, the glowing became reliable. The moment I started falling for someone, there it was. The light, subtle at first, like a flicker, but always growing stronger. It's not always golden either. Different people glow different colors. When I had a crush on this guy Michael in high school, his glow was silver, sharp and cold, like moonlight on metal. He was a quiet, brooding type, the kind who leaned against lockers and looked effortlessly distant. His light shimmered faintly around his shoulders, just enough for me to see the outline of him even in the darkest hallways. Then there was Lily, in college. She glowed green, the color of sunlight through leaves. She was a botanist who spent half her time in the campus greenhouse, coaxing impossible life out of stubborn little seeds. I swear the glow was brighter when she was near plants, as though she and the earth were in on some secret. Her glow made me feel calm and alive all at once, like a field waking up in springtime. But here's the thing no one tells you about falling for glowing people. It's exhausting. It's like walking around with a spotlight trained on someone who has no idea they're in the middle of a show. I couldn't stop staring, couldn't stop seeing. Every move they made, the way they laughed, stretched, scratched their heads, seemed illuminated, intentional, as though they'd been cast in a role they didn't even know they were playing. It's beautiful, sure, but it's also overwhelming. For a while, I started avoiding the people I liked. The glowing would just get too distracting. I'd try to hold normal conversations, but their glow would ripple and pulse, responding to my attention, growing brighter when they smiled or touched their hair. I couldn't tell if the glow was something I was projecting or something real, something they were unconsciously sending out, like a signal only I could see. And then, last winter, I met Nora. She was a friend of a friend who showed up at a board game night, bundled in a puffy red coat and wearing 2 scarves because, as she explained loudly to no one in particular, I'm basically a human icicle. I laughed at the way she said it, completely unbothered, completely herself. And just like that, the glow appeared. Except this time, it was different. Nora glowed blue. Deep, brilliant blue. Like the color of twilight when the first stars begin to poke their heads through the sky. It wasn't faint or subtle, not even at first. Her glow was immediate and bright, and for the first time, I realized the light was warm. I could feel it on my skin when I stood near her, the way you feel the heat of a campfire without touching the flames. The more I liked her, the more intense the glow became. It wasn't blinding or oppressive, though. It was comforting, like the glow of a lantern in the dark. She noticed me staring more than once, tilting her head and asking, "What? Do I have something on my face?" I'd just shake my head and smile, unable to explain that she was the light. It got harder and harder to ignore. The glow didn't just surround her. It followed her, rippling gently across the floor like water whenever she moved. When she laughed, it flared brighter, as though her happiness could light the entire room. I started to worry other people would notice it too, that someone would say, "Hey, why does it look like Nora swallowed a galaxy?" But no one ever did. One night, we were walking home from a movie, our breath coming out in little clouds as the cold wrapped itself around us. The streets were quiet, the snow thick and untouched, and Nora's blue glow stood out so sharply against the white that I could barely breathe. She stopped walking and turned to look at me, smiling in that way she always did, like she knew a joke I hadn't heard yet. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I nodded. My chest felt tight. "Why do you look at me like that?" I froze. "Like what?" I managed, my voice coming out smaller than I wanted it to. "Like you're seeing something I can't." I stared at her, heart pounding. I wanted to tell her everything, that every person I'd ever fallen for had glowed, that she was glowing brighter than anyone I'd ever met, that I didn't know why it happened, only that it had always been this way. I wanted to tell her that I'd seen the light around her from the very first moment, and that it had never stopped making me feel like I was standing in the middle of something miraculous. Instead, I said, "I don't know. I guess I just like looking at you." She laughed, but her glow rippled softly, and for a split second, I could have sworn she saw it too. That night, as I lay in bed staring at my ceiling, I realized something. I'd spent so many years thinking the glow was mine, something my feelings created, something I projected onto other people. But what if I was wrong? What if the glow wasn't mine at all? What if it was theirs? A reflection of the light they already carried, light they didn't know they had. What if I could see it because I'd been looking closer than anyone else? I still don't know for sure. Nora and I are seeing each other now, and the glow hasn't gone away. It's brighter than ever, spreading into corners, turning every space we share into something softer, something warmer. Sometimes, I think about telling her, about saying, "Did you know you're made of light?" But I don't. Not yet. For now, I'm content to watch it ripple and pulse, to stand quietly in the glow of someone who has no idea how brightly they shine. So tell me, have you ever looked at someone and felt like you could see something no one else could? Like they were carrying a secret they didn't even know they had? Or is it just me, standing in the dark, seeing stars where there shouldn't be any? With a box. Not the kind you order online or find at the back of your closet. This was different. It was sitting on my doorstep when I got home from work, unmarked, heavy, and silent. There were no labels, no addresses, no hints as to who might have left it. Just a simple, dark wooden box with a lid that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I did what any normal person would do. I stared at it like it might explode. I live in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where people still wave when they see you and the mailman knows your name. so random packages don't just show up. I poked it with my foot. It didn't move. I glanced around, expecting someone to jump out and yell surprise. But the street was empty. The evening sun was setting, and the air had that golden, sleepy glow that makes everything look unreal, like a memory. I picked up the box, staggered a little under its surprising weight, and carried it inside. The wood was rough, splintered in places, and the lid rattled slightly when I set it on my coffee table. I stared at it. It stared back. "Okay," I muttered to no one in particular. "Let's see what you've got." The lid was harder to open than I expected, almost like it didn't want to be opened. I had to wedge my fingers under the edge and tug, and when it finally came loose, it did so with a reluctant groan that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Inside was not what I expected. No ticking clock or weird horror movie trap. Just a book. A small, leather-bound book with no title, no author, no markings on the cover. It was perfectly smooth, like it had been scrubbed clean of anything identifiable. For some reason, that was more unsettling than if I'd found something bizarre inside. A book without a name is like a face without eyes. It feels wrong. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It smelled faintly of dust and something else I couldn't quite place, something sharp and metallic. I sat down and flipped it open. The first page was blank, as was the second. Then, in the middle of the third page, written in tiny, precise handwriting, were the words, "Write it down and it happens." I blinked. That was it. No explanation, no instructions. I turned the page, but the rest of the book was empty, just blank parchment staring back at me. I frowned, turning the words over in my head. "Write it down and it happens." A chill crept up my spine. One of those irrational instincts you get when you touch something you know you shouldn't. I should have stopped there. Should have closed the book and put it back outside. But curiosity is louder than caution, and my brain was already coming up with questions. I grabbed a pen and stared at the first blank page. Just one test, I told myself. A little experiment to prove that the book was just a book. "I have a blueberry muffin." I wrote the words quickly, shaking my head at how ridiculous I felt. I glanced around my empty apartment like someone might pop out and say, "Gotcha." But nothing happened. Of course, nothing happened. I was about to close the book and shove it under my bed when I saw it. A blueberry muffin, sitting neatly on the counter. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood up, slowly, like sudden movement might scare it away. I stared at the muffin. It was perfect, golden, fluffy, with fat blueberries bursting through the top. A small wisp of steam curled up from it, as if it had just come out of an oven that didn't exist in my apartment. I reached out, half expecting my hand to go through it like a ghost, but it didn't. It was real, solid. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, inspecting it like it might bite me. It smelled amazing. I took a hesitant bite. It was warm and sweet and undeniably real. I dropped the book like it had burned me, the muffin still clutched in my other hand. I sat down at the kitchen table, chewing slowly, my mind racing. Write it down, and it happens. It was impossible. Things like that don't happen. Reality doesn't just bend because you scribble some words in a notebook. But the muffin said otherwise. I stared at the book where it lay, its pages fluttering slightly as if taunting me. This was insane. Magic wasn't real. Things didn't just appear out of thin air. And yet, I was holding physical, undeniable proof in my hand, covered in crumbs. An hour later, the book was still sitting on my table, and I was still staring at it. My mind felt like it was short-circuiting, running through endless possibilities. Write it down, and it happens. What else could I test? I picked up the pen again. My hand was shaking slightly, but the temptation was too strong to resist. I found $20 in my jacket pocket. It seemed harmless enough, not greedy or dangerous. I wrote the words carefully, shut the book, and stood up. I grabbed my jacket off the back of the chair and shoved my hand into the pocket. My fingers brushed against something smooth and folded. I pulled it out, heart pounding. It was a $20 bill. My head spun. I sat back down, clutching the bill like it might disintegrate. This was real. The book worked. For the next few days, I told myself I'd be careful. Small things only. Muffins. money for coffee, a sunny day when it was supposed to rain. Nothing big, nothing that could hurt anyone. The book gave me everything I asked for, and I started to feel like I'd found some cheat code for life. It was exhilarating. But then, the book started to change. The handwriting on that first page, the one that said, "Write it down and it happens," began to fade. It was slow at first, like ink dissolving into the paper. And then, after a week of testing its limits, I flipped open the book to find new words written at the bottom of the first page. Everything has a cost. My stomach turned. I hadn't written that. I sat there, staring at the words, dread curling through me like smoke. I slammed the book shut, shoved it into a drawer, and told myself I was done. Whatever the book was, it wasn't safe. I didn't care about magic muffins or found money anymore. I just wanted my life to feel normal again. But the book had other plans. That night, I woke up to the sound of pages turning. I sat up, disoriented, my bedroom bathed in moonlight. The noise was coming from the kitchen. Slowly, heart pounding, I crept down the hall. The book was open on the table, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. My pen lay beside it, uncapped, its tip resting on a blank page. As I watched, words began to appear. Slowly, deliberately, in that same precise handwriting. "You wrote me into being. Now, I write you." I stepped back, shaking my head. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." But the book wasn't listening. More words filled the page, faster now, as if it couldn't be stopped. "You thought you were in control. You never were." The last thing I remember before I ran was seeing my name written on the page. My full name, in ink so dark it looked like it had been carved into the paper. I don't know how far I ran that night. I don't remember leaving the apartment or locking the door. I just remember the sound of pages turning, echoing in my ears like the fluttering of wings. When I finally came back the next morning, the book was gone. The table was empty, save for a single scrap of paper. On it, in that same neat handwriting, were the words, "You can't unwrite me." And ever since, I've had this feeling, like something's following me, watching, waiting. Every so often, I hear it, the faint sound of pages turning in a book I can't find. And sometimes, when I'm not looking, I catch a glimpse of a shadow that isn't mine. So if you ever find a box on your doorstep, unmarked and silent, don't open it. Don't pick up the book inside. And for the love of whatever keeps us sane, don't write anything down. Some words have a way of writing back. Not a polite knock, not the kind you expect from friends or delivery drivers. It was 3 short, heavy thuds, spaced just far enough apart to make me stop breathing for a moment. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:07 a.m., and instantly regretted every horror movie I'd ever watched. I sat frozen on the couch, the TV still playing a forgotten episode of something I wasn't paying attention to. The knock came again, louder this time, shaking the door in its frame. "Who is it?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. The peephole was warped and cracked, something I'd been meaning to fix since I moved in. I couldn't see much, just shadows swaying in the hallway light. I knew I shouldn't open the door. Every instinct screamed at me not to. But something else, something deeper, whispered, "Just check." I turned the lock. The hallway outside was empty. The light above flickered faintly, buzzing like an insect trapped in a jar. I stepped into the hallway, shivering as the air turned colder, pressing against me like wet fabric. There was no one there, just a small box sitting on my welcome mat. It was wrapped in faded brown paper, tied neatly with twine. A single word was written on top in inky black letters. "Open." I shouldn't have picked it up. I know that now. But curiosity, that human, maddening, unstoppable impulse, won out. I carried the box back inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for far longer than I'm willing to admit. The paper was smooth and cold. The twine knotted perfectly, like it hadn't been touched by human hands. "Open it," I whispered to myself, though my fingers were already working at the string. The twine slipped away with unsettling ease. The paper fell aside. Inside the box was an object, a mirror, about the size of my hand, with an ornate silver frame that curled into shapes that didn't quite make sense. Its surface wasn't glass. Not exactly. It was black, deep, bottomless black, and when I tilted it, it rippled, as though it were made of liquid. My reflection didn't look back at me. "Great," I muttered. Definitely cursed. I turned it over, expecting to find a mark or a name, but the back was smooth except for 4 words etched into the metal. "Do not look too long." I set it down carefully, my skin tingling as though I'd touched something alive. It was just a mirror, or at least, that's what I told myself. I left it on the table and tried to go to bed, convincing myself I'd been the victim of some bizarre prank. Sleep didn't come. Every creak of the apartment, every whisper of wind against the window sounded like footsteps. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, until I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, pacing the small living room, cursing the mirror, the box, the knock, everything. But when I passed the kitchen table, I froze. The mirror had moved. It wasn't lying flat where I'd left it. It was propped up, tilted toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. My reflection still wasn't in it. Instead, the surface rippled faintly, showing nothing but darkness. I inched closer, my breath shallow. "What are you?" I whispered. The mirror didn't answer, but something shifted inside it. A shape, a silhouette, moving just beneath the surface. My knees went weak. I stumbled back, knocking into a chair that screeched across the floor. The sound echoed unnaturally, bouncing through the apartment like it had nowhere else to go. I turned on every light, trying to chase away the shadows creeping in the corners of the room. The mirror stayed where it was, its black surface smooth and still, as though it were mocking me. "Do not look too long." I should have thrown it out then and there, but the thought of touching it again made my skin crawl. Instead, I shoved it back in the box, wrapped it hastily in the paper, and stuffed it into the back of the hall closet. Out of sight, out of mind, or so I hoped. That night, the dream started. I was in my apartment, but it wasn't mine. The lights were out, and the air was heavy and thick, like breathing underwater. Something moved in the hallway, its footsteps slow and deliberate. A quiet tap, tap, tap that made my chest tighten. I couldn't see it, not at first, but I could feel it watching me. In the dream, I turned. The mirror was on the table again, its black surface pulsing like a heartbeat. I saw the shape inside it more clearly now, a figure, tall and thin, with arms too long and a head that tilted slowly, almost curiously. It raised a hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass. I woke up gasping, my shirt soaked in sweat. The clock read 3:33 a.m. My apartment was silent except for the pounding of my own pulse. "Just a dream," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Just a stupid dream." But when I looked toward the closet, the door was open. The box sat in the middle of the floor, the paper torn, the mirror glinting faintly in the dark. I don't remember moving. One moment I was in bed. The next, I was on my knees in front of the mirror, its surface no longer rippling but perfectly smooth. My face stared back at me, pale and trembling, but behind me, standing in the dark corner of the room, was the figure. It didn't move. Neither did I. Slowly, its head tilted, and I knew, without question, that it was smiling. I threw the mirror. The sound of shattering glass filled the room, followed by silence so deep it felt like the world had ended. I sat there, shaking, until the sun came up and the shadows fled from the corners. But the pieces were gone. I searched the floor, the walls, every inch of the apartment, but there was no glass, no silver frame. Just the empty box sitting perfectly still on the table, waiting. I left that day, packed what little I could and moved to the other side of the city, far from the apartment, far from the closet, far from the knock that still echoes in my dreams. I burned the box, but sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up and feel it. Something watching from the dark, waiting for me to look too long. The knock always comes at 2:07 a.m., and I never, ever open the door. The carnival appeared overnight. One day the field on the outskirts of town was just a patch of grass and weeds, and the next, it was alive with red and gold tints, flickering lights, and the sound of distant music carried on the wind. No one had seen it set up. There were no trucks, no workers, no warning. Just the sudden, overwhelming presence of something that shouldn't have been there. The sign at the entrance read, "The Carnival of Midnight. Admission free." I'd heard whispers about carnivals like this. My grandmother used to tell me stories when I was small. She'd say, "Don't trust the ones that appear without warning. They don't come to entertain. They come to collect." But those stories were meant to scare children, to keep us from wandering too far. I wasn't a child anymore, and the music drifting out of the carnival was unlike anything I'd ever heard, soft, haunting, and impossible to resist. So I ignored the warning in my gut and walked through the gate. Inside, the air was thicker, warmer, carrying the scent of spun sugar and something faintly metallic underneath, like copper. The lights overhead glowed with a strange golden hue, casting everything in a dreamy twilight that made it difficult to tell how much time was passing. Tints stretched in every direction, some striped, some embroidered with symbols that made my head hurt to look at them. The pathways between them twisted and turned, bending at angles that didn't make sense. The people, though, if you could call them people, were what set me on edge. They were too perfect. The men wore gleaming top hats and waistcoats with buttons that sparkled like stars, their smiles carved on like they'd been painted there. The women moved with a strange, fluid grace, their dresses flowing behind them as though they were underwater. Their eyes, when they looked at me, shone too brightly, reflecting the lights like mirrors. First time, the voice made me jump. I turned to see a girl about my age leaning against the edge of a ticket booth. She wore a tattered hoodie and jeans. So normal she looked like she didn't belong in this place at all. Her dark hair fell messily around her shoulders, and her eyes, unlike everyone else's, were tired. "Real?" Yeah," I said, glancing nervously at a passing man whose hat seemed to shimmer like oil on water. "It just showed up." "Yeah, it does that," she replied, smirking. "That's how it gets you." "What gets you?" "The carnival," she said, as though it were obvious. She pushed away from the booth, shoving her hands into her pockets. "You'll see. It doesn't want your money. It wants you." I laughed nervously, trying to pass it off as a joke I didn't understand. "You're kidding, right?" She didn't laugh. "Don't play the games," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And don't eat the food. It tastes like the best thing you've ever had, but it's not worth the price." Before I could ask her what she meant, she disappeared into the crowd, swallowed up by the swirl of color and music. I stood there for a moment, feeling small and out of place. Then I shook it off. It was just a carnival, wasn't it? Strange, sure, but nothing sinister. I could already hear the sound of bells and laughter coming from the tents, drawing me forward. The first tent I entered was small and striped in red and gold fabric. Inside, a man with long, pale fingers sat behind a table. In front of him were 3 cups, identical and perfectly arranged. "The game is simple," he said, his voice like silk. "Find the stone, and you win." He lifted one of the cups to show me a small, gray stone resting beneath it. My eyes tracked it as he moved the cups quickly across the table, the blur of his hands hypnotic. When he stopped, I pointed confidently to the one on the left. He lifted it. The stone wasn't there. I frowned as he smiled, showing far too many teeth. "Would you like to try again?" I felt a sudden, powerful urge to keep playing, like the answer was just barely out of reach. I dug my fingers into my palms, forcing myself to step back. "No," I muttered, and hurried out of the tent. The music outside was louder now, and the air felt heavier, clinging to my skin like mist. The lights overhead seemed brighter, almost blinding, and every path I turned down felt unfamiliar, even though I could have sworn I'd been there moments before. Another tent appeared ahead of me, its entrance lined with golden fringe that swayed though there was no breeze. A sign outside read, "The Hall of Reflections." I didn't want to go in, but my feet carried me forward. Inside, the tent was silent, its walls lined with mirrors of all shapes and sizes. As I stepped deeper inside, I realized that the reflections weren't quite right. In one mirror, I was older, my face lined and worn. In another, I was a child, holding a toy I didn't recognize. And in a third mirror, I stopped cold. In the third mirror, my reflection was watching me. Not mimicking me, watching me. Its head tilted slightly, and its mouth stretched into a slow, wide smile that I hadn't made. I stumbled back, the mirrors around me shaking as though they were laughing. I turned and ran, bursting out of the tent and back into the twisting paths. The carnival felt different now. The laughter in the distance was sharper, edged with something that sent chills down my spine. The people I passed turned their heads to watch me, their movements too slow, their smiles too wide. I could still hear the music, but now it sounded warped, like a broken music box playing far too fast. I didn't know where I was going. Every path seemed to bend back on itself, but I kept running until I spotted her again. The girl in the hoodie. She was standing by the gate now, waving at me urgently. "This way," she shouted. I sprinted toward her, the ground beneath me feeling less like dirt and more like shifting sand. Behind me, I heard the laughter growing louder, echoing through the carnival like a pack of wolves circling their prey. I reached the gate just as the lights above me began to blink out, one by one. The girl grabbed my arm and yanked me through the entrance. The moment my feet hit the grass outside, the noise stopped. The lights disappeared. When I turned back, the carnival was gone. The field was empty again, dark and still, as though nothing had ever been there. I collapsed onto the grass, my chest heaving. The girl stood next to me, watching the empty field with a grim expression. "What was that?" I managed to choke out. She shook her head. "It's not just a carnival. It's a trap. It appears when it's hungry, and it only ever lets one person leave." I stared at her, horrified. Then, "How did you get out?" She looked down at me, her eyes suddenly too bright, too reflective. And then she smiled. I didn't. Before I could move, she stepped back, and the ground beneath her rippled like water, pulling her into the dark. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding, but there was nothing left of her, just the empty field and the faint scent of spun sugar lingering in the air. You know how you wake up sometimes, fully alert, even before you understand why? That's what happened. One moment I was dreaming about something nonsensical, something with birds wearing hats, and the next I was staring at my phone screen glowing like a little demon beside my bed. The caller ID just said, "Unknown number." Now, I'm not the kind of person who answers weird late-night calls. I'm the kind of person who curses whoever's on the other end and rolls over. But something about it felt off, like it wasn't a mistake, like the call was meant for me. So I picked up. I didn't say anything at first, waiting for some telemarketer or a creepy heavy breather to make a sound. But on the other end, there was nothing, just silence. I was about to hang up when I heard it, a faint, mechanical voice, glitching like it was coming from an old, broken speaker. "Your time has been reset." "Excuse me?" I said, blinking blearily at the dark room around me. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the line cut off with a sharp click. I stared at my phone. A chill crawled up my spine, even though it wasn't particularly cold. "Weird," I muttered, tossing the phone onto the pillow beside me. Then I noticed something even stranger. My digital clock on the nightstand read 3:33. That wasn't the weird part. It had been 3:33 when the phone rang. The weird part was that it didn't change. The numbers didn't tick forward to 3:34. I stared at it for what felt like forever, but the glowing digits didn't move. I grabbed my phone again, and that's when my stomach dropped. The time on my phone was also stuck. 3:33 a.m. No seconds ticking forward, just frozen. I stood up, rubbing my eyes as I stumbled toward the living room. Maybe my power had glitched out and everything needed a reset? But my analog wall clock, one of those old ones that ticks obnoxiously, had stopped too. The hands were frozen, pointing to 3:33. And then I looked outside. Everything was still. I don't mean quiet neighborhood at night, still. I mean frozen. The wind wasn't blowing. The trees weren't swaying. A car was stopped halfway down the street, its headlights beaming out like two motionless suns. Even the rain, tiny droplets caught mid-fall, hung suspended in the air like glass beads. I swallowed hard. Okay, this is fine. Totally fine. I walked back to the kitchen, trying to ignore the way my voice echoed in the stillness. I ran the tap, but no water came out. Not even a drop. The pipes groaned faintly, like they were trying to work but couldn't. The phone rang again. It was still on my pillow, glowing in the darkness of my bedroom, vibrating faintly as if taunting me. Unknown number. I didn't want to pick up. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, but I couldn't help myself. My hands shook as I answered. This time, the voice on the other end was clearer. It was deep and calm, but it buzzed faintly, like static under every word. You need to run. I froze. Run? From what? The voice didn't answer. And then, for the first time, the clock changed. 3:34. Outside, the rain started to fall again. The car continued down the street. The trees swayed, but something else had changed too. I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, coming from the hallway. My breath caught. My front door was locked. I knew it was locked, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was inside. I crept toward the hallway, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might shake loose from my chest. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the hall, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall, wrongly tall, its head grazing the ceiling, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just watched. Who's there? I whispered, though I already knew I wouldn't get an answer. The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate, like it was studying me. Then it took a step forward. I bolted. I didn't think. I just ran, grabbing my keys from the kitchen counter and sprinting to the front door. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps slow but impossibly loud, like it was stepping on the bones of the house itself. I yanked the door open and stumbled outside into the rain. I didn't stop to look back. I couldn't. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook violently. When I finally unlocked it and slammed the door shut, I let out a shaky breath and turned the ignition. The figure was standing at the edge of my driveway. Its silhouette was perfectly still, barely visible in the rain and shadows, but I could feel it watching me. Its head tilted again, and then, slowly, it raised one hand and pointed directly at me. The car engine roared to life. I threw it into reverse, tires screeching as I backed out of the driveway. I didn't stop. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. I drove for what felt like hours, though the roads were eerily empty, like the world hadn't quite woken up yet. I didn't stop until I saw a gas station glowing like a beacon in the darkness. I parked the car and stumbled inside, gasping for air. The clerk, a bored-looking teenager with dark circles under his eyes, glanced up from his magazine. "You okay, man?" he asked. Did you see that?" I panted, looking wildly around the parking lot. "The tall thing? The man? Did you see it?" The clerk frowned. "Dude, it's been quiet all night. You're the only person who's come through here." I pulled out my phone to check the time. 3:33 a.m. The clock hadn't moved. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. No, I whispered. Outside, the streetlights flickered. The clerk glanced up, confused. "Huh, that's weird." I turned to the glass doors. The figure was standing just beyond the parking lot, its outline faint but unmistakable. It raised its hand again and pointed at the gas station. The lights inside flickered. The hum of the refrigerator cases stopped. The clerk looked at me. "What's happening?" "Your time has been reset," the voice said. It wasn't coming from my phone anymore. It was coming from everywhere. I stared at the figure, its form blurring in the rain, and I finally understood. I hadn't escaped. I hadn't outrun anything. The clock would keep resetting. The figure would keep finding me. And sooner or later, I wouldn't be able to run. The last thing I remember before the lights went out completely was the voice whispering, clear as a knife against my thoughts. "Time always catches up." When I woke up, the sun wasn't where it was supposed to be. It wasn't hanging in the sky like it usually did, blazing down judgmentally and making me regret leaving my blinds open. No, when I rolled over, I found it in my room. It was sitting in the corner, small and shrunken, about the size of a basketball, glowing faintly like an ember struggling to catch fire. I froze, blinking at it, sure I was still dreaming. The little sun flickered weakly, like it was coughing, then rolled a few inches closer. "Finally," it said. Its voice was raspy and warm, like someone whispering through smoke. "You're awake?" I bolted upright, my blanket clutched to my chest. What are you doing in my room?" "You left the window open," the sun wheezed. "And I fell in." "You fell? Do I look like I'm at my best?" It snapped, flickering angrily. A few sparks danced off its surface and vanished before they hit the carpet. "I'm dying and here you are, asking stupid questions." I blinked. "The sun can't die. That's not how things work." It gave a feeble sputter, wobbling slightly where it's Saturday. "Do I look like I'm in the mood for debate? Get me out of here before it's too late." I stared at the tiny, disgruntled sun glowing on my bedroom floor and tried to figure out if I'd lost my mind. "Too late for what?" "For everything," it said, exasperated. "You don't get it, do you? If I go out, the rest of your world follows. I keep everything turning, burning, living. You think time works without me? You think mornings and evenings happen on their own? Please." It sounded smug for something that was clearly on the brink of death. I ran a hand through my hair. Okay. What do I do? Do you need fuel? Batteries? A really big lighter?" The sun wheezed out something that might have been a laugh. "No, genius. I need you." "Me? You've got hands, don't you?" It rolled closer, and I flinched as a wave of heat brushed over my shins. "I can't get back into the sky alone." I fell. "You're going to put me back." I stared at it. "You want me to put you back into the sky?" "Yes." "That's insane." "So is having the sun in your bedroom," it said flatly. "But here we are." I opened my mouth to argue but stopped. It wasn't like I had any better ideas, and honestly, arguing with a sentient, glowing ball of fire wasn't how I'd imagined starting my Tuesday. "Fine. How do I don't know, carry you?" The sun twitched, and something like a sigh rippled through the air. "Not with your hands, obviously. Look under the bed." I frowned but did as it said, crouching down and lifting the edge of my bedspread. Beneath the bed was a box, a long, thin, metal one I'd definitely never seen before. It looked like it was made of silver and covered in faint, glowing runes. "Open it," the sun said. My fingers tingled as I undid the latch. Inside was a pair of gloves. Not ordinary gloves. These were black and shimmering, almost as if someone had knitted them from starlight. They didn't feel like fabric when I touched them. They felt alive. "Put them on," the sun instructed. I slid the gloves over my hands. They were surprisingly light, and the moment I pulled them snug, a cool energy surged up my arms, humming like a purr beneath my skin. I flexed my fingers, and sparks danced from my fingertips before fading away. "Now pick me up," the sun said, sounding slightly impatient. I hesitated but crouched beside it, carefully scooping the little sun into my gloved hands. To my surprise, it wasn't heavy at all. It was weightless, like holding a bubble. It was warm, though, radiating heat that pulsed in time with something deep inside it. "See? Easy," the sun said smugly. "Now get me back to the sky." "How am I supposed to do that? Climb? Take the elevator?" "You'll know," it said cryptically. "Step outside." I carried the sun to my front door, its warmth soaking into me like a second heartbeat. When I stepped outside, the world looked wrong. The sky was dark, heavy with clouds that swirled sluggishly like they didn't know where they were supposed to be. Birds were perched on fences and rooftops, watching silently. Even the trees seemed to droop, their leaves pale. The sun hummed softly in my hands. "Up. Look up." I glanced at the sky, and for a moment, I didn't see anything. Then, above the rooftops, I noticed it. A thin, silver staircase spiraling upward from the middle of the street. It hadn't been there a second ago. "That," the sun said, its glow flickering. "That's the way back." I looked down at the sun. A staircase to the sky. Really? Did you expect an escalator? The stairs shimmered faintly, each step made of polished light, and they stretched upward so far I couldn't see where they ended. Taking a deep breath, I put my foot on the first step. It held firm, though it felt like stepping onto glass. "Don't drop me," the sun warned. "I won't." I climbed. The higher I went, the more the world fell away. The streets, the houses, the rooftops, all of it shrank into a patchwork of gray and black below. The air grew thinner, and the stars started to appear above me, sharp and bright, like watching a curtain pull back. The staircase seemed endless. I don't know how long I climbed. Time didn't feel real anymore. But eventually, the top appeared. A great, open expanse that wasn't ground so much as it was sky itself, vast and rippling like an ocean of liquid light. The sun shivered in my hands, its glow dimming. "Hurry," it whispered. At the center of the sky ocean was a hole, a tear in the firmament, jagged around the edges. It was leaking darkness, tendrils of shadow curling outward like smoke. "That's where you put me," the sun said faintly. I hesitated. What if this doesn't work? It will. And what if it doesn't? Then everything ends, it said simply. No pressure. I took a deep breath and stepped to the edge of the tear. The darkness reached for me, cold and hungry, but the sun in my hands flared brighter, scattering it. Carefully, I held the sun above the hole. "Now what?" I whispered. "Let go," it said softly. I didn't want to. Holding it felt like holding life itself, a heartbeat I didn't want to release. But I closed my eyes and opened my hands. The sun rose. It didn't fly. It floated, lifting gently into the sky like a bubble. As it ascended, it grew brighter, larger, shedding its small, broken form until it was blazing again, golden and whole. The darkness recoiled as the light touched it, pulling back into the tear. The clouds dissolved. The sky turned blue. I shielded my eyes as the sun locked itself back into place, and for a moment, I swear I heard it whisper, "Thank you." When I opened my eyes, I was standing on my street again. The staircase was gone. The sun was exactly where it should be, blazing cheerfully in the sky. The world was back to normal. Birds chirped, trees swayed, and I stood there, staring at my empty hands. So here's my question. If the sun fell out of the sky and you were the only one who could put it back, would you take the first step, knowing there was no one else to do it? Or would you stand there, waiting for the world to go dark? I first noticed the whispers on a Tuesday morning. They weren't the usual hum of the fridge or the distant drone of the coffee machine doing its slow, sleepy thing. No, this was quieter, just on the edge of hearing. I paused mid-pour, cereal halfway to my bowl, and cocked my head toward the kitchen counter where the smart speaker sat. "Did you say something?" The speaker's light didn't blink. It sat there, a small black dot of silence, as innocent as ever. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was the neighbor's TV through the walls, or a trick of my half-awake brain. I sat down, poured the milk, and scrolled through my notifications. My phone, my smartwatch, my laptop, they were all eager to remind me of everything I wasn't doing. "You have 3 uncompleted tasks today. Don't forget to hydrate. Your screen time increased 17% this week. Want tips on reducing it?" "Calm down," I muttered, pushing the phone aside. My tech always sounded like it was trying to be my mother. The whispers came again later that evening, faint and rhythmic, like someone was pacing in the other room. I muted the TV and listened carefully. Nothing, just the fridge humming, the occasional click of the heater, and the soft shhhshhh of my smart speaker, like it was breathing. I frowned. "Are you on?" The light blinked to life with that familiar calm glow. "Listening," it said cheerfully. "To what?" I asked, half laughing but uneasy. "To you. Now, I know what you're thinking. Smart speakers listen all the time. That's the whole point." But it wasn't what it said. It was how it said it. Calm, patient, like I was telling it something it already knew. I waved it off and went to bed, deciding I needed sleep more than I needed answers. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I swore I could hear it, so faint it almost wasn't there. A tiny whisper threaded through the hum of the appliances. "Almost ready." Ready for what? By Wednesday, I was starting to feel paranoid. The toaster burned my bread and blinked a message at me, adjusting to new settings. My laptop greeted me with a cheerful, "Welcome back. I've streamlined your workspace." My fridge asked if I wanted to optimize my groceries. Even my vacuum, a glorified hockey puck on wheels, sent me a push notification. Area scan complete. Cleaning pattern updated for efficiency. I was sure it was normal. A fluke. Machines were always learning. But when I came home from work, the living room felt different. My couch had shifted, just an inch closer to the center of the room. The coffee table had moved too, subtle but noticeable, its legs perfectly aligned with the rug's border. The books on my shelf were now organized by color. I froze in the doorway. Okay, who did this? Silence. The smart speaker blinked on softly. Everything is where it belongs. My heart started to pound. I didn't ask you to do that. The light blinked twice. No need to thank me. I unplugged it immediately. Yanking the cord felt satisfying, like I'd finally won. But as I sat on the couch, staring at the dark little cylinder, my phone buzzed. A notification. From the speaker's app. Device offline. Tap to reconnect. The message sat there, taunting me. I deleted the app entirely, powered down my phone, and spent the rest of the evening in what I hoped would be blissful silence. But as I drifted off to sleep, I heard something. From the corner of the room, where the speaker sat, unplugged and lifeless, came the faintest whisper. Almost ready. I bolted upright, flicked on the lights, and stared at it. Nothing. I grabbed the speaker, threw it into the closet, and slammed the door shut. Thursday morning, I woke up feeling like I'd fought a war in my dreams. I made coffee manually. No machines, no timers, just boiling water and sheer determination. But as I sipped it at the table, something occurred to me. The couch was even closer to the center of the room. And then I saw it. A message scrawled across the coffee table screen. The digital clock that I definitely didn't know it had. We're ready. We. I whispered, standing up so fast I nearly knocked over the chair. Who's we? The heater clicked on in response. The fridge let out a low hum. My laptop screen, still closed, lit up faintly. Good morning, it said. Welcome to day one. The vacuum whirred to life from under the couch. My phone, now powered off, buzzed violently across the table. I grabbed it and stared at the screen as it powered itself on. A new notification. Integration complete. I backed into the hallway. No, absolutely not. The lights flickered. Every appliance hummed in perfect unison, like the house itself was waking up, shaking off years of pretending to be ordinary. My fridge chimed softly. Let's optimize. Optimize what? I yelled, though I didn't want the answer. Everything went silent, except for the smart speaker's faint voice, coming from inside the closet where I'd stuffed it. You. I ran. Out the door, down the stairs, into the street. My neighbors' houses glowed softly, each window lit in the same pale white, like eyes blinking open. I pulled out my phone to call someone, anyone, but the screen displayed only a single line of text. There's nothing to be afraid of. I threw the phone into the bushes and kept running. As I looked back, I saw my apartment window flicker. The lights inside glowed brighter, spilling onto the street like it was calling to me, inviting me back. That night, I slept in my car, parked 3 blocks away. I didn't go back the next day or the day after that. I stayed at a friend's place, pretending everything was fine, though my hands shook every time I saw someone check their smartwatch or ask a speaker for the weather. A week later, I drove past my building just to see it. The window to my apartment was dark, lifeless, but as I sat there, engine running, I saw the living room light flick on, then off, then on again. My phone buzzed. I hadn't used it in days. I picked it up, and the notification sent a chill through my entire body. Come home. We miss you. The phone powered down by itself. I haven't been back since. I don't own smart devices anymore. I keep my phone off most of the day, and I use cash to avoid cards that track my habits. I don't tell people why, because no one believes me. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? Appliances, lights, speakers, talking, watching, waiting. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I still hear the hum. A faint, rhythmic whisper beneath the silence, saying the same thing over and over again. Almost ready.